State your name for the record.
Charles Overstreet.
And how are you employed?
I am a professor of psychology at Tarrant County College and a consultant for the Tarrant County, Denton County, and Collin County Veterans Courts.
Did you have an opportunity, based on my request and Mr. Moore's request, to examine and evaluate a person in custody of the Erath County Sheriff's Office by the name of Eddie Ray Rao?
I did.
And do you recall when you did that again?
March 14th, 2014.
What did you specifically do in examining and evaluating Mr. Rao?
I was asked by Mr. Moore to go see a veteran that had been accused of capital murder that was in jail and to do an assessment and give me his opinion about what I thought his state of mind was.
Did you make your own independent, professional and professional history and background and professional judgment? Did you make a diagnosis independent of anyone else of what you believe was wrong for Mr. Rao?
I did.
And what was that diagnosis?
That he suffers from symptoms consistent with paranoid schizophrenia, that should be ruled out by a psychiatrist, and that there were indications that he also suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder.
Did it show any type of paranoid schizophrenia or anything like that?
He did.
And help, I know the judge knows this, just for the record, what is paranoid schizophrenia?
It's a thought disorder. The age of onset is usually at around 25 years old. The symptoms are delusions, many times hallucinations, inappropriate affect, and the inability to process information normally.
And also, were you requested to make an evaluation regarding if you suffer from any severe mental disease or defect?
I was.
And did you make that evaluation?
I did.
And so more specifically, do you have an opinion at the time of the offense conduct that he suffered from a severe mental disease or defect and he did not know his conduct was wrong?
He was suffering from, in my opinion, a mental disorder and disease and defect, and he did not know the consequences of his actions at the time.
Now, in all fairness to you, and I know your report was dated, I think, a year or so ago, did you put that in your report specifically, that finding?
I did not. I was asked an open-ended assignment there. I was asked to go see him and give my opinion as to what I found. And no reference was made to what his status in his case would be.
But your testimony today is that is your conclusion based on your professional evaluation of my client.
That's my conclusion.
Now, Your Honor.
You may.
Doctor, you said your PhD was in social work. Do you have a degree in psychology?
I do.
Or do you have a doctoral degree in
I
psychology?
have a Master's of Science in Psychology.
So you do not have a doctoral degree in psychology?
I do not.
Are you a licensed physician in the state of Texas?
I'm not.
Your PhD is in clinical social work.
It is.
Now, your report that we were provided before trial stated your conclusion that in all probability, without the convergence of these factors, Mr. Rao's mental illness, the weapons in the range, this event would not have occurred. Is that still your conclusion?
That's my conclusion.
And a moment ago, you said that it is now your opinion that he was suffering from a mental disease or defect, and he did not know his conduct was wrong. You didn't say it was a severe mental disease or defect. What severe mental disease or defect did you find?
Paranoid schizophrenia is considered a severe mental disease.
Okay, well, your diagnosis that you described during direct was that he suffered from symptoms consistent with schizophrenia to be confirmed by a psychiatrist, and PTSD. Is PTSD recognized as a severe mental disease or defect?
It is.
What is the source of the trauma that triggered the PTSD?
He meets the requirement in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, for having suffered a stressful event.
And what was that?
And it's consistent with the criteria that we used in the Army and the criteria we use in the Veterans Courts.
Well, what was the stressful event that you believe qualifies under the definition
Well,
of PTSD?
There's two of them, one being deployed in a hostile fire area and exposed to indirect fire, which he did experience on Balad, which is
true of everyone on that base then.
true.
Okay.
And
Regardless of whether they are engaged in
Robert,
combat.
could the witness answer the question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, what was your question,
So
sir?
that was true of everyone who was in Balad.
Yes,
So regardless of whether they were engaged in combat.
yes.
So does everyone who has PTSD has a severe mental disease or defect?
When their symptoms are active and if it's disruptive of their normal functioning or they have impaired, rational decision making as a result of it, it would be considered a serious mental disease or defect.
What is your source for the belief that PTSD is recognized as a severe mental disease or defect?
I guess I need the context of your question. If you're talking about the clinical definition of a severe mental disease, as opposed to the legal definition with regard to insanity, I would.
The legal one, since that's what we're dealing with. Where has it been recognized as a severe mental disease or defect?
In the clinical literature, it's recognized as a serious mental disease, which can result in and does result in acute hospitalization or long-term hospitalization. And the definition in the clinical literature of a serious mental disorder is one that requires extensive inpatient care. So that's why the VA medical system has an extensive 90-day program for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, my question then is, your semantics matter. Where has it been recognized as a severe? You described a serious mental disease or defect. Where has it been recognized as a severe mental disease or defect standing alone?
In the psychiatric system and in the clinical literature.
Can you cite us sources, such as articles or opinions or legal cases or anything like that, on which you're relying for that belief?
Ehlers and Clark, the cognitive theory and post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma victims is an article that describes the process and what kind of disruptions it causes in a person's ability to function. The criteria in the DSM-5, which is written by the American Psychiatric Association, describes the three criteria. It's measured in the post-traumatic stress disorder symptom checklist, where the criteria in the DSM-5 that cause a disruption or maladaptation is spelled out in the subscales in the post-traumatic stress disorder symptom checklist.
Now, are you describing conditions which are secondary to PTSD, or are they primarily? I mean, if the sole diagnosis is PTSD, are there sufficient symptoms to diagnose someone with a severe mental disease or defect under the Texas law?
No, PTSD is not a diagnosis that you would use in an insanity defense.
Okay, so excluding so if we were just dealing with the PTSD, you would not be your conclusion that he had a severe mental disease or defect.
Exactly.
So your basis is on your diagnosis, and I quote you from earlier, that he suffered from symptoms consistent with schizophrenia.
Exactly.
Now, did you explore any of the other, you said symptoms consistent with, that leaves open other possibilities, does it not?
Not many, because
Did you factor into the possibility of external sources or external factors such as substance abuse?
I did.
All right, now let's get to some of your conclusions. Are you familiar with the state of Texas law regarding what the term wrong means and under Texas Penal Code 801, how we define whether a defendant knows his conduct is wrong? Are you familiar with the state of Texas law on that?
Not specifically.
What is your understanding of what the word wrong means?
From a
A legal standpoint.
A legal
Under Texas
standpoint.
law, what does it mean when the law says that did not know his conduct was wrong? What does wrong mean in that context under Texas Penal Code 8.01?
That means that he would have the capacity to evaluate whether his actions at the moment that he commits them were wrong.
What does wrong mean?
That they don't meet the social, I was talking about the social standard for what wrong is.
Yeah, I want to know what you think under Texas law, what the word wrong means.
That it's,
Well,
I'm not sure what your question is, sir.
and that's my objection. That was the basis of my motion to limit it, is that for him to sit there and say, what is the meaning of the word wrong under the Texas Penal Code? There is no definition of the word wrong under the Penal Code. And therefore, to ask him what it is, it's not defined.
Your Honor, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. If the witness does not understand or has an incorrect understanding of what the state of Texas law is, his testimony regarding his conclusions and opinions would not only be unhelpful to the jury, it would be misleading to the jury. Secondly, we received no notice at all of the nature of his opinions. The only notice that we received regarding this witness is that his opinion was going to be, in quote, in all probability, without the convergence of these factors, Mr. Rouse's mental illness, the weapons in the range, this event would not have occurred, which gives absolutely no guidance to the trier of fact regarding any issue in the state's case in chief or the affirmative defense of insanity. So regardless of what his opinion turns out to be as to what wrong means, we received no notice as to his ultimate conclusion that he was going to state that the defendant suffered from a severe mental disease or defect and he did not know his conduct was wrong.
You're going so fast, I can barely get you, and I know the reporter can't. Your objection is overruled, and again, we're going back to roughing, and that's the law of the state of Texas. It's not defined in the penal code, but an expert in the field ought to be familiar with roughing and say the test for determining insanity is whether, at the time of the conduct charged, the defendant, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, did not know that his conduct was wrong, period. I continue the quote. Under Texas law, wrong in this context means illegal. If you're going to hold yourself out as an expert in the field, you need to be familiar with that concept, so it's subject to cross-examination. You may continue.
Thank you. What is your understanding of what the word wrong means under Texas law, Texas insanity law?
My understanding is that that wrong would imply that he has the capacity to understand that what he's doing is illegal or against a moral standard. It's my opinion at the time he did not have the capacity to make that assessment.
All right, well, let's talk about you. In your report, you talk about him, and I'm going to give you some quotes from your report on page 4 of your report that we have, which did not include an opinion as to the ultimate issue of insanity. Am I correct?
You're correct.
On page 4 of your report, you say, Mr. Ralph and Chris Kyle continued to fire at the targets. And Mr. Ralph became increasingly suspicious that Chad Littlefield was, quote, going to harm him. It was then that Eddie Ralph turned and fired at Chad Littlefield. Now, it's not in your report. Did Mr. Ralph describe to you Chad Littlefield being in possession in his hands of any weapon?
No, he did not. He said that he had a weapon.
On his side, right?
Yes,
Did he describe any weapon in the hand of Chad Littlefield?
he did not.
Did he describe any verbal threats that Chad Littlefield had made or did at the moment make to to the defendant?
He did not.
Under what theory of law then could, even if we believe the delusion that they were going to harm him, under what theory of Texas law could the defendant have believed that his conduct was not wrong? Under what theory?
That he had a person behind him who was armed, who he was interpreting his behavior. That Eddie was interpreting Mr. Littlefield's behavior as threatening, and that he was standing.
Specifically, let's address that. Specifically, what behavior?
That they were not. There's some evidence that Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield thought that he was acting
No,
bizarre.
we're not talking about what they thought. We're talking about what the defendant thought. That's non-responsive, Your Honor. Objection.
Sustained, overruled. Let him finish his answer.
At that point, it's my theory that he misinterpreted their discomfort with him as being threatening. He had been experiencing paranoid delusions for the time period before that, and he describes having those delusions the whole time he's on his way to the range. When he gets to the range and all the firing is going on, there's evidence that just the situation right there could increase the intensity of those delusions. There doesn't have to be an overt threat on the part of Mr. Littlefield, because it's the state of the mind of the defendant that's the problem. He's misinterpreting the motives of the people that are there. They're there to help him. He's misinterpreting their behavior as being threatening. He's also misinterpreted the behavior of other people of being threatening leading up to that on several occasions. So he has a habit or a pattern of doing that. He misinterprets the situation, defines it as threatening, and then he responds that way. So with the firearms and the range and the intensity of all the interaction there, it's my theory that he misinterpreted the motives of Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield, and he turned around and fired on Mr. Littlefield.
Okay, well, does your quote of the defendant was that Mr. Ralph and Chris Kyle continued to fire at the targets, right? So they were both shooting at targets at that point.
That may be a misstatement on my part. I was getting information from Mr. Ralph and putting it in a narrative.
Yeah, Mr. Ralph and Chris Kyle continued to fire at the targets. Mr. Ralph became increasingly suspicious that Chad Littlefield was going to harm him. Did he ever describe an imminent threat?
Mr. Ralph, he did.
From whom?
From Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield, primarily Mr. Littlefield.
What was the imminent threat?
That the plan on their part was to kill him.
So there was a plan, but was it imminent?
Yes.
Did he perceive, did Chad Littlefield ever make a gesture toward him indicating he was about to harm him?
Not that I know of.
Did he ever make a statement to him that he was about to harm him?
Not that's been reported.
He just believed at some point during the day they were going to harm him.
Yes.
At some point during the day.
Well, and at the moment.
It was then that Eddie Ralph turned and fired at Chad Littlefield. Okay. Well, there's another. Okay. We've addressed that one. Now, are you familiar at all with the ME report? Did you review that report as part of your preparation?
Yes, I did.
So you were aware that both men were shot in the back.
Yes.
Was that consistent with what the defendant had told you?
Yes.
Well, he indicated that he had shot Chad Littlefield in the chest, right?
You know, I don't remember I think he did say that, but I don't remember specifically. He said he fired on Mr. Littlefield.
You know, he said Chad Littlefield was facing him and he shot him in the chest, right?
I don't know that he got that specific. I know that he said that he turned and fired on Mr. Littlefield. I'd have to look at my notes.
We'll come back to that. Then after he shot Chad Littlefield, your report says, and that the defendant, his account to you, was that he then turned and shot Chris Kyle several times.
Exactly.
Now, he described feeling threatened by Chad Littlefield in some vague, he's going to eventually kill me, right?
Right.
Under what theory of Texas law could, even if the original delusion about Chad Littlefield was true, under what theory of law could the defendant have believed shooting Chris Kyle at that moment was lawful?
That the two were acting in consort, that the threat was coming from not only Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield in his mind, After he shot Mr. Littlefield, he said, I shot Mr. Kyle because I knew that he would shoot me at that point.
He had just shot his friend, and so he had to shoot him, otherwise he was going to defend his friend.
Exactly.
Under what theory of law was shooting Chris Kyle justified then? If he shot Chris Kyle because he knew he would defend his friend that the defendant had just shot, under what theory of law is that justified?
The theory would be that the delusion includes Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield, that they're acting in consort, and during the time he's in the truck riding to the range, all the way till he gets to the range, he's getting increasingly anxious, and he feels like they're acting with a plan to kill him, and so he sees them both as part of the same threat.
So he perceives a plan starting all the way when he gets into the truck all the way to the range.
As he's riding to the range in the truck.
Did he ever specify to you at what moment in time he believed the threat was imminent?
Not a specific time, but he tells me that there are weapons, there are lots and lots of weapons in the truck, and there are lots and lots of weapons on the range, and there's not much conversation going on between him, Mr. Kyle, and Mr. Littlefield. He repeatedly said that he was perplexed by that. There's some confusion, and then he gets to the range, and as they're going into the range, and he starts to feel like it's imminent, that there's nobody else there but him and the two that are with him. There's no range master or anybody else out there, and he noted that they're in a really isolated area, and so at that point he starts to feel like it's going to happen any minute, that he's going to be shot.
Okay, well, let's go to the next one then. And this is straight from your report. He then noticed that Chad Littlefield was quote unquote twitching and was afraid he would get back up. So he shot him in the head and again in the body. Under what theory of Texas law could the defendant have believed shooting Chad Littlefield at that moment was lawful?
I guess as a product of the original action, the original shooting.
That he was going
That
to grow a new spinal cord, get up, and attack him?
Well, that would imply that he has the logical ability to make that assessment at that point. I mean, all this probably happened in a very, very short period of time. And so I guess the irrationality of the original act and the adrenaline that results from that and his delusional state was all part of the action, all the shots that were fired.
Well, that brings me back. Are you familiar with Texas Penal Code 8.01, definition of insanity?
Yes.
Where in that definition of insanity does it use the phrase capacity to evaluate?
It does not use that.
It doesn't say that as a result of an inability to, or a lack of the capacity to evaluate, the defendant did not know his conduct was wrong. It says as a result of severe mental disease or defect, he did not know his conduct was wrong. You included in your definition of wrong the ability or the capacity to evaluate whether something was illegal. But that's not what the law says, is it?
It's not the wording in the law, but it's consistent with the wording in the law.
How so?
The capacity to make a decision requires that you do not have a thought disorder, that you don't have a paranoid delusion, and that you can accurately and logically assess the circumstances or what you see around you.
Are you licensed in any way to make formal diagnoses regarding schizophrenia?
No, I don't make the diagnosis of schizophrenia. When I do an assessment for the court, I document the symptoms. If I put schizophrenia in the report, I rule out schizophrenia because I really think that requires a psychiatric evaluation and additional assessment, more than I'm going to do in a 2 or 3 hour interview with somebody. It needs to be done in a clinical setting with more evaluation than I do in an initial assessment.
What training do you have in forensic psychology?
I don't have any specific training in forensic psychology.
Have you ever been appointed by a court to evaluate a defendant for an insanity?
I have not.
Are you familiar with Article 46C.102 of the Code of Criminal Procedure regarding the qualifications of court-appointed psychiatrists or psychologists?
I am.
Do you meet any of those qualifications?
I do not.
Why didn't you include your current conclusions regarding the insanity of the defendant at the time of the offense in your original report?
I was sent there to see him and render an opinion as to what his state of mind is and what some of the symptoms are. I was basically gathering information and creating a report similar to what I do for any of the courts that I work for. So at that point, I didn't see my task and because I didn't see my task as making a conclusion about insanity on his part, it was to actually just provide an assessment of what his mental status was and what kind of recommendations I would make, just like I always do when I do an assessment like that. If I see that somebody may be suffering from dementia or some kind of neurological condition, then I'll put in there that they need to see a neurologist. If I see that they have a psychiatric condition or that they need additional assessment from a psychiatrist or medications, I don't prescribe medications, so I will send them to a psychiatrist. If I think they need psychotherapy, I'll recommend that and send them to some kind of a psychotherapist. I may send them for psychological testing if they need an IQ or a personality battery or something like that from a licensed clinical psychologist. So my job, as I see it, is to gather information and do an initial assessment and then make recommendations for what kind of testing or treatment or that they need at that point. And then many times I'll design a treatment plan and put that all into effect so that.
Are you qualified to evaluate for insanity if you can't make an actual diagnosis of severe mental?
Not according to the Code of Criminal Procedure. Insanity is not a clinical word. It's only a legal term.
Mr. Attorney. Mr. Ralph, you're still under oath. You may have a seat there and we'll proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. State your name again for the record.
Jody Ralph.
And are you the same person who testified a few days ago in this trial?
Yes, sir.
Really just have a couple of follow-up questions. After your testimony, I think I asked you to go back and check your date book in terms of a conversation you had with Mr. Kyle.
Yes, sir.
More specifically, when did you talk to Chris Kyle about your son needing help? Was it, let me ask you, was it before or after your son got out of the hospital? The last time?
It was before he was admitted to the hospital.
And I have on the projector the picture you described with your son and you and the description of his military service. And how old was your son back then?
He was 20.
And how long had he been in the Marine Corps?
He left for boot camp when he was 18. So he'd been in for 2 years.
I have no further questions, Judge. She went through the military history the other day.
Ms. Ralph, who was in this photograph?
Eddie and Jen.
Jen Weed?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll pass the list.
And this is a very brief follow-up. So in stage 339, it depicts, it's like your son's smoking something.
Yes.
And in that photograph, do you have any idea when that was taken?
I do not.
Now, the person we see there looks really different than the person we see there, doesn't it?
Yes.
And was this photograph taken when he got out of the Marine Corps?
Yes, sir.
No further questions.
I have no further questions.
All right, you may step down.
Would you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
Mitchell Dunn, MD.
And Dr. Dunn, What kind of a medical doctor are
I'm a psychiatrist.
you? And where do you currently practice your psychiatry?
I have a mixed practice. Mostly I work at Terrell State Hospital, where I'm the medical director of the forensic unit. I also have a private office in Dallas, in which I do both forensic and general psychiatry.
What are some of the things you do at Carroll State Hospital?
I am the only psychiatrist on the forensic unit that's composed of 30 patients, and I also have other forensic patients that have been admitted to some of the other wards of the hospital, so I consult on those. For the patients on my unit, I'm evaluating and treating them for severe mental illness and evaluating their competency to stand trial. I assess whether they are getting adequate treatment for their mental illness, prescribe their medication, and then make a determination as to when they might be ready to return to court. Some of the patients are quite symptomatic, as you might imagine.
When you say forensic, what do you mean by that?
Forensic essentially means area of psychiatry that's interaction between psychiatry and the law. So the individuals on my unit in Terrell have been found incompetent to stand trial, and the court has asked us to make an assessment and give treatment to try to determine when they might be able to return to court to stand trial.
Now, there's a difference in being incompetent to stand trial and being insane at the time of the offense, correct?
Correct.
What is incompetent to stand trial when you say that? What do you mean by that?
Incompetent to stand trial means that the individual either can't work with their lawyer or doesn't really understand the proceedings against them. And that can be due to a mental illness. Most commonly, it can also be due to what we now call intellectual disability, but what for decades was called mental retardation. And so that's a significant difference, obviously, between an insanity case.
So incompetency is basically a two-pronged. You can't communicate with your lawyer, and you really don't have a clear understanding of the proceedings against you, correct?
It's an and/or proposition. You might be able to do one, but not have an understanding, or you might have an understanding but not be able to work with your lawyer.
Have you, in the past, had any opportunities to evaluate people for not being incompetent, but for being insane at the time that an offense was committed?
It's hundreds of times.
When we talk about insane at the time of the conduct charge, we're talking about a mental illness, correct?
Yes.
We're talking about a severe mental illness, is that correct?
Yes.
Because that's what the law says, is that it is a person is suffering from a severe mental illness or defect.
Yeah, the terminology is severe mental disease or defect.
Okay.
Correct.
What does that mean?
Well, that's not specifically defined in the statute, but typically in terms of an insanity defense, we think of a severe mental disease or defect as being one in which there's elements of psychosis, meaning some type of break in reality testing, not knowing what is actually occurring or what is true and what is not.
That would be the definition of psychosis.
Yes.
Tell me that again.
A break in reality testing is the common definition.
Okay. And what are some kinds of psychosis?
Typically, the most common types of psychosis are hallucinations, which are false sensory perceptions. In schizophrenia, that might most commonly be an auditory hallucination, hearing a voice when there's no actual stimulus, or visual hallucinations, seeing something when there's no actual stimulus. You can also have a tactile hallucination, feeling as if something is crawling on you and there's nothing there, or an olfactory hallucination, which would be smelling something when there's no actual stimulus there. Less common would be what we call a gustatory hallucination. That's actually tasting something, when there's nothing on your tongue. So those, basically, I just went through the five senses. So it's these sensory misperceptions or hallucinations. But there's also delusions, which is actually more common. A delusion is a false belief that you can't be talked out of despite evidence to the contrary. In fact, some people say the definition of a delusion being a fixed false belief is the shortest definition we have in mental illness, because we tend to be a little bit verbose. So those are what we call the more common positive symptoms of psychosis. In addition to that, though, you can also have problems with your thought organization. So disorganized speech can be a symptom of psychosis, and disorganized speech is felt to be evidence of also disorganized thinking. Disorganized behavior is also one possible symptom, and then part of the kind of diagnostic criteria that's also included in schizophrenia, but this is not necessarily considered psychosis, would be a inappropriate affect, meaning the way that you appear to others, the way that you respond in certain situations. So I kind of went over the answer a little bit there, but sorry about that.
You got involved in my request in this case of Eddie Ralph, correct?
Yes.
When you are asked to do an evaluation, what do you do? What do you do to prepare to make that evaluation?
Well, I try to review as many records as I'm able to review that would be appropriate. So that would include, certainly at the minimum, the offense report and any mental health records that might be available, witness statements that are appropriate to the offense itself. Speak to the attorney who's communicated with me about what their concerns might be. And then oftentimes there's other ancillary material that I have available to review. Sometimes that includes some school records, other statements from witnesses that are certainly available in this case, but aren't also always available in other cases. And then try to go in with as objective a state as possible and do an interview of the defendant, trying to determine as much as I'm able to their mental state at the time of the offense.
And you indeed went to the Erath County Jail and interviewed Eddie Ralph, correct?
Yes, I did.
How long did you interview him on April 15th?
6 hours and 15 minutes.
Is that a typical length of an interview for something of this nature?
No, it's not.
Well, explain that.
Well, it's longer than I usually spend with a defendant.
Why did you spend longer with Eddie?
I had already reviewed a lot of information, so I had questions about some of that information. I'd had the chance to review some of these audio taped interviews, so I had a lot more information going in. In addition, I wanted to get a sense of the course of his mental illness over a period of time. So, I tried to go from day one forward to the time of the offense. Also, I knew this was, kind of a big deal. So I wanted to make sure I spent enough time with him.
Do you feel like you did?
Yes, I do.
You had reviewed before you went and interviewed him, had you reviewed the hospital records from the Veterans Administration in Reno?
Yes, I had.
So you were aware when you interviewed him that there was some past history of mental illness.
Correct.
When did that start?
The initial hospitalization for Mr. Ralph was in July of 2011.
And you reviewed those records, correct?
Yes, I did.
And what was the diagnosis back in July of 2011 of Ben Ralph by the VA hospital?
It was psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, post-traumatic stress disorder, rule out bipolar disorder not otherwise specified, rule out bipolar disorder not otherwise specified, and rule out substance-induced psychosis.
What does psychosis not otherwise specified mean?
It's kind of a default diagnosis. It means that it was clear that he was psychotic, but they weren't willing to pin it to any specific cause. And so they just kind of left the diagnosis of psychotic disorder not otherwise specified as their discharge diagnosis.
And what does rule out substance abuse psychosis? What does that mean?
It means that there should be further assessment to determine whether there's a possibility that the psychosis was secondary to some substance.
Okay. So what did that tell you about the July 2011 hospitalization?
What did the diagnosis itself tell me?
Yes.
That it was clear that he was psychotic, that they had no question about that. They weren't sure of the cause of the psychosis.
And did you review the next time that the records from the next time he went to the VA hospital?
Yes, I did.
And when was that?
That was just 5 days after his discharge. On July 30, 2011, he was readmitted.
Which one was it that he thought he had to take one?
That was the initial one from July 23, 2011 through July 25, 2011. He came in complaining that he had some tapeworm that was causing him significant weight loss, and he thought he was wasting away.
Okay. And would that be classified in your world as a delusion?
Yes,
What is a delusion?
a delusion is a false fixed belief.
And so thinking you have a tapeworm would be a false fixed belief.
If indeed it's false. They did a test and he did not have a tapeworm, and he continued to believe that he did,
Okay. What does that tell you?
that it was fixed, that despite evidence to the contrary, he continued to have that same belief. And that's, in essence, the definition of a delusion.
And that's a symptom of a psychosis.
Yes, that is a type of psychosis.
You'll have to excuse me, I don't have any kind of training in psychology or psychiatry. So I stumble around a bit, I apologize.
I'll do my best to teach you.
Thank you. So the next one was just short. The next hospitalization was shortly after the first one. And what was the diagnosis then?
The diagnosis on that second hospitalization was psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, rule out substance-induced psychosis. They also included a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, cannabis abuse, and rule out bipolar disorder not otherwise specified. So in essence, the same diagnosis they'd given him the week before.
And if my memory serves me correctly, the next hospitalization would have been in September, or no, I'm sorry. Yeah, September of 2012.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
How long a period of time do you remember? Does it show that he spent in the VA hospital? Well, actually, he was sent to Green Oaks first, correct?
He was initially sent to Green Oaks, that's true. He was there for about a day, and then he was sent for 2 days to the VA hospital.
The first, let me back up real quick. The first two hospitalizations in July and then into August of 2011 did the VA hospital prescribe him any medication?
Yes, they did.
What did they prescribe him?
With the first hospitalization, they prescribed him Wellbutrin, which is an antidepressant. Depakote, which is a mood stabilizing agent, Prazosin, which is normally a antihypertensive, but it's also given to help with nightmares, particularly in people who are having symptoms of PTSD, and risperidone, which is an antipsychotic agent. In addition, they gave him zolpidem, brand name Ambien, for sleep, and medicine called hydroxyzine, which is actually a antihistamine, but it's used for anxiety in some individuals.
So they gave him medication for anxiety and some antipsychotic medication.
And mood stabilizing medication and sleep medicine, yes.
So in September of 2012, this was after the incident that we heard about, that we call it the fish fry, where he threatened to kill himself and his family. Is that correct?
Yes,
You familiar with that?
yes, I am.
And so the police arrested him and took him back to Green Oaks. Did you review those Green Oaks records?
Yes, I did.
And what was their evaluation of it?
They indicated that he had a psychotic disorder and that he was a veteran who previously had PTSD. I'm afraid I don't have the specific diagnosis that Green Oaks gave at that time.
Okay, but he was then transferred over to the VA hospital, correct?
Yes,
And how long did he spend in September of 2012 at the VA hospital?
just 2 days.
Okay. And what was their evaluation?
They diagnosed him with a major depressive disorder with psychotic features and a rule-out diagnosis of bipolar II disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder by history and alcohol dependence and cannabis abuse.
When you say cannabis abuse, what does that mean in your doctor terms?
That he admitted that he had been smoking marijuana at some point, and he also had a urine drug test that was positive for the metabolite of marijuana.
And are you familiar with the metabolite of marijuana?
I'm afraid I don't know what the name of it is. I can tell you that's not what the urine drug screen tests for is not THC. It's not marijuana intoxication. Urine drug screen simply tests for whether somebody has used marijuana. So urine drug screens will usually be positive for marijuana about a week after somebody's used if they're not a chronic user, and for up to a month after they've used if they're a long-term user. What the drug screen doesn't show is whether somebody's actually intoxicated or used that day or the day before. It just shows that at some point they used within that time frame, depending on whether they're a short-term or less frequent user versus a chronic user.
The VA hospital has now a couple of times diagnosed Eddie Ralph with PTSD, correct?
Correct.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
That was their diagnosis.
Correct.
The next time that Eddie was hospitalized was in January of 2013. Is that correct?
Yes.
And this was January 19th of 2013, which was the day of the incident at Jim Weed's apartment where he held them at night point.
Correct.
How long did he spend in Green Oaks Hospital on starting January 19th?
2 days.
And what was their evaluation of him?
They described him as having psychosis, but I don't actually see in the documents that I copied down what their specific diagnosis was.
But he was then, after a couple of days, again transferred to the VA hospital in Dallas.
Correct.
And how long did he spend in the VA that time?
4 days.
And what do the records reflect was their evaluation?
They noted that he was paranoid that somebody was trying to hurt his girlfriend, that he was also paranoid about the government. He was diagnosed with psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, mood disorder not otherwise specified, and a history of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was once again given a rule-out diagnosis of substance-induced mood disorder and substance-induced psychotic disorder, and he was known to have a history of post-traumatic stress disorder and a history of major depressive disorder.
And did they prescribe any medication for him?
Yes, they did.
What did they prescribe for him?
They prescribed Risperdal, which is an antipsychotic medication, and Depakote, which is a mood stabilizing medication, and also the hydroxyzine, the anti-anxiety medication that's actually more of an antihistamine.
So some doctor at the VA hospital saw him for several days and prescribed that kind of medication for him, correct?
Yes.
As a doctor, what does that indicate to you?
That they believed he had psychotic symptoms and a psychotic illness, and likely not one that was simply going to go away when he was no longer intoxicated.
Let's talk about that. Talk about intoxication-induced psychosis.
Sure.
What is it?
An intoxication-induced psychosis is one in which an individual has psychotic symptoms secondary to being intoxicated on some substance. So when you're in the acute phase of intoxication, then you may become acutely paranoid or even see things. Hallucinogens, obviously, LSD, PCP, can cause visual hallucinations. That's why people will take them, because they want to, go on a trip. Methamphetamine, while people take that in order to get, energized or hyped up or euphoric, will frequently cause significant paranoia to the point of paranoid delusional beliefs. And during intoxication, these people very well can look like they have a schizophrenic illness. They, may be seeing things or hearing things or being acutely paranoid. Once they're no longer intoxicated, once the system, the drugs out of their system, then that's no longer intoxication psychosis. And if there are, continued psychotic symptoms, we don't consider that a drug-induced psychosis.
So a substance-induced psychosis would be just, for example, you drank to a point of extreme intoxication, and at the peak of that, you may have some kind of delusion. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that'd be very uncommon with alcohol, but if indeed alcohol would cause that, that would be correct.
But my point being, as soon as you stop drinking, it begins, the alcohol, after it is absorbed into the system, it starts to eliminate from the system, correct?
Correct.
And so when you sober up, however long that takes, if you still have delusions or psychosis, then you might think that your problems aren't substance abuse related, correct?
Correct.
Same thing with marijuana. Would that be accurate?
Correct.
That once you stop using marijuana, at some point it begins to wear off.
Right. I mean, a normal high lasts, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. And while your drug screen is still positive for days or even weeks afterward, you're not still high when your drug screen is positive. That's why all the probationers are worried about, having a positive urine test days after they've smoked. They're not still intoxicated, but it's still being released into their urine.
And marijuana stays in your system, regardless if it still has an effect on you. The fact that you smoked it, that may stay in your system for 30 days, wouldn't it?
If you've been smoking a long time, that metabolite will still show a positive test for having used marijuana.
And certainly you can test people that are qualified, chemists can test for THC in your blood, can't they?
Yes.
Uh, And that would be a real benefit to determine how intoxicated a person might be on marijuana if you had a blood test for them.
I really don't know what the kind of THC dosages versus, how intoxicated somebody is. That I would think that would vary. So I can't kind of show you the linear graph on that, but certainly a toxicologist could be helpful in terms of telling you whether somebody's likely to still be intoxicated according to blood level.
Well, so he's at the VA hospital in January of 2013. When is he released?
He's released from the VA on January the 25th, 2013.
And do they prescribe any kind of medication for him upon his release from the VA hospital?
Yes, they do.
What do they prescribe?
Risperdal, Depakote, and hydroxyzine.
The same basic medication they've been prescribing all along.
Yes,
And again, Risperdal is an antipsychotic medication.
yes.
Now, when you went to visit Eddie back in April of 2014, what does your normal exam consist of when you go and visit a client like that?
Well, normally I'm asking them to tell me what their life story is. Go from, when they were born, who they were raised by, have them take me through high school and, jobs after that, relationships. Also ask them kind of as we go along about their mental health history and, about symptoms regarding mental illness that they might have had. In addition, I ask about medical history, social relationships, medications that they were on. I do what's called a mental status examination, which is kind of the psychiatric equivalent of the physical. There's certain things that we're checking for, including their cognitive abilities, their current emotional state, any symptoms of psychosis they might be having at the time, the ability to do kind of simple calculations, that kind of thing. For Mr. Routh, I used a standardized assessment called the MOCA, Montreal Cognitive Assessment. I don't always do that, but I did with him.
And what do you want that to do?
Oh, it's just to see what his cognitive abilities were, how well he was kind of functioning in terms of being able to follow directions, testing his memory, having him, there's certain things on it like drawing a cube and drawing a clock, just see if he's able to do that. Sometimes people who have significant neurocognitive deficits have great difficulty in doing some of those tasks. And I also gave him a test of malingering or faking of psychosis called the MFAS, the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms Test.
Is that a standard psychological test that psychiatrists use to determine that?
Yeah, it's a pretty standardized test. It's a very brief test for malingering of or faking of psychotic symptoms. And
When you gave it to Eddie, what did you discover about it?
well, that his score was not indicative of him faking symptoms of psychosis or mental illness.
What else did you do when you were evaluating?
I think that's about it. Just a fairly lengthy clinical interview as well as using those two tests that I mentioned.
And so after you got through interviewing Eddie,
I guess to interrupt, maybe to answer, I did, of course, ask him all about his mental state and his actions around the time of the offense. So I kind of, walked through that in the days leading up to the time of the offense, and, also an assessment of what his mental state was during the time that I was interviewing him. So we spent a lot of time, on those days and that day.
what did you discover about the offense for Eddie?
Well, I discovered that he was having significant symptoms of psychosis, not just on the day of the offense, but in the several days leading up to the offense. In fact, the weeks, going from the incident that occurred with the ninja sword with Ms. Weed and her roommate, and the hospitalization that occurred, at the Green Oaks in the VA, he was having a lot of unusual thinking. Delusional beliefs that people were going to try to harm him, that people were going to try to harm Ms. Weed and even harm her roommate at the time. That led to that hospitalization. But even prior to that, he was having paranoia about his neighbor, a guy who I believe was actually an investigator for the Lancaster Police Department.
What about that? What kind of, what led?
Well, for months, he believed that this individual was with the Mexican mafia and was a drug dealer because he'd seen some type of van backed up to his house. And so he concluded that this neighbor was actually, dealing with Mexican gangs and was dealing drugs. It was
Did he tell you when that was?
just in the months before. In fact, he said that that's part of what he was believing back in that September 2nd incident with the fish fry, that he was believing that his neighbor was part of the Mexican mafia. It's not anything that he did anything about at the time, but it was just one of the delusional beliefs that he had that was kind of ongoing. So he had continued to believe that up through and into the incident that occurred in January with the ninja sword and the mid-January hospitalizations. And then after he got out of the hospital, he wanted to go to work. He was working at a cabinet shop.
This is January 25th after 2013 when he got out.
Yeah, he got out then. He spent the weekend with Ms. Weed. And then when he went to work at the cabinet shop, he'd worked there off and on for a while, and he trusted there were two Hispanic named or surnamed individuals who worked there, but he started to believe that these individuals maybe were cannibals. And he believed that because he said his perception was thrown off, that their food looked off, like it wasn't food that people would normally eat, but maybe it was flesh of some sort. And he began to be concerned that they might try to harm him. He said there was a cold snap that was occurring at the time. It was gotten cold, and the workshop area had a heater, and I guess they had floor heaters or something, and he felt that maybe there was a rotisserie and he was supposed to be cooked. So he was turning his body the way you would if you were on a spit in a rotisserie, thinking that perhaps these individuals were actually were supposed to eat him and kill him. And he was afraid to have his back to them. Normally he would sit at the workbench with his back to them, but instead he was kind of sitting, he said, kind of sideways so he could kind of keep his eyes on them the whole time, making sure they weren't going to do something.
Is that an indication of schizophrenia?
That is the type of belief that people with schizophrenia can have. I mean, most people with schizophrenia don't believe that their coworkers are cannibals. Individuals who would hear this story, who aren't used to talking to people with schizophrenia, would think that that's either so made up or fantastical that it couldn't happen with anybody. But yeah, I mean, in schizophrenia, we see individuals who have really, really bizarre ideas, things that most individuals have never encountered. I see stuff at Terrell every day that most people just couldn't believe other people could believe.
Well, let me ask you this. This was a period of time where he was working at the cabinet shop right before this issue,
Yeah.
And if he looked normal to his boss and other people, but he's having these thoughts, how do you explain that?
People with mental illness, in large part, look like you or I. If you were to come to Terrell State Hospital's forensic unit and look out into the day room, most of the time you would simply see, people watching TV or playing dominoes or talking to staff members. I'd say 95% of the time, if you looked out, you wouldn't even know that you were at a mental hospital. But then somebody will walk by and they're talking to themselves, or they're screaming to somebody they can't see. Or had a woman the other day who tried to pull down her pants and show me her penis. Have a guy who believes he's pregnant with triplets, and he was traveling from coast to coast because the Illuminati in California, wanted him to be there. And you think those triplets are going to be born in 2 years. I guess he's having elephants. But he truly believes this stuff. And most people wouldn't know that, that's even what mental illness is about. But if you watch him walk by in the hallway, you can't tell necessarily he has a mental illness. He doesn't look crazy. Mental illness is not like being tall. If somebody's tall, you look at them and you say, oh, they're tall. And you ask them, did you play basketball? But, mental illness, unless you're talking to somebody, or unless they're clearly, obviously responding to somebody that you can't see, or, talking to voices, it's not necessarily the way it's portrayed in movies. I mean, some of the time it is, but that's a small percentage of the time. Like I said, 95% of the time, they're looking normal, and they can even respond directly to questions that you ask them. It's frequently times when you ask them kind of more open-ended questions, so they start kind of going off on tangents that don't really make any sense. But just because somebody looked normal, sorry, this is a long-winded answer, but just because somebody looks normal or is able to work in a cabinet shop doesn't mean that they're not mentally ill.
And if the person is having those kind of thoughts, maybe an indication, would it be correct if they were not taking those medications that were prescribed for them, or they weren't working?
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, I think it's a common misperception that if you just take your medicine, you're going to be fine. That's simply not true. I mean, if that was the case, I wouldn't have people in the hospital that had been there for years. Some people do respond. About a third of patients with antipsychotic medication respond completely. Their symptoms go away. No more voices, no more delusions. They function entirely well. They go back to their jobs. They're able to function. You can't, don't have any idea. About a third of them get better. The delusions lessen intensity or go away, or maybe another one will pop up a little bit later, but doesn't necessarily affect their day-to-day functioning as much. The voices kind of recede some in the background, or they're much less frequent. Even somebody who's hearing voices that are really bad aren't hearing voices all the time. So about a third certainly get better, and about a third really don't get help that much. A lot of times their hostility decreases, and they kind of learn that they can't yell at people or hit them, but they still get discharged from the hospital. If we kept people in the hospital just because they still had psychotic symptoms, we wouldn't have nearly enough room.
The time frame was after February 25th, 2013, when he was released by the VA hospital, and February 2nd, that time period, correct?
Correct.
You were telling the jury some of his statements he made to you about his coworkers. That would have been like a Thursday or so after he was released.
I think he was released on a Friday, and then he went back to work, and that might have been on a Monday or Tuesday when he went back to work.
Okay. Anything else you want to add about that time period?
Yes. He was telling me that during that time, when he was thinking that the coworkers might actually be cannibals, that he began to think that perhaps they could be half pig and half man, what he called a pig hybrid. and that these thoughts began to, become, in his words, deeper and deeper, began to believe them more strongly, and that he began to see other people around him that believed might be hybrid people. He thought other things around him were going on that were strange, that when he blew his nose, what came out of his nose looked kind of strange. And that by the Thursday and Friday before the offense occurred, he began to feel, in his words, that pigs were taking over the earth.
How do you determine whether or not he's just making this up?
Well, people that are simply making up psychotic symptoms usually are going to say the kinds of things that you see on the TV or movies. They're going to talk about hearing a voice that told them to do a specific thing, or they'll talk about, aliens coming out of the wall or the ceilings or the floor. When you're watching a movie, that kind of stuff, because they don't know what real mental illness is like. But I'll admit this is very strange, but the symptoms that people with real mental illness describe are ones in which, there's a variety of kind of benign environmental stimuli that come in that make them start to believe certain things that kind of trigger stuff. And then whatever's going on around them, seems to confirm that stuff that we wouldn't notice, like, the heater in the work area all of a sudden becomes a rotisserie. The food that doesn't look like what food normally should look like becomes, something that cannibals might eat. Plus, another thing is that when I'm evaluating somebody in a criminal case and they're telling me psychotic symptoms like this, I'm trying to determine, are they just saying this specific to the offense itself? But he was reporting a bunch of stuff that didn't have anything to do directly with the offense, like the smell or the color of his snot. That's not what somebody who malingers or makes up mental illness talks about. Also, there's just a lot of extraneous stuff that wasn't directly related to shooting anybody that he was reporting. That's what true mental illness is like. That all this kind of stuff that we wouldn't notice all of a sudden becomes confirmation for this delusional thinking that is germinating in their mind.
So, through your training and experience and dealing with these kind of minds in peril, this wasn't all that unusual.
As unusual as this is, this wasn't all that unusual. Correct.
Well, what else kind of things was he telling you that he was experiencing or thought he was experiencing in this particular time period right before February 2nd?
Well, he told me that in the day before the offense, before Ms. Wheat came over, he went over and spoke to his neighbor, the one who was the investigator that he thought was part of the Mexican mafia. And when he knocked on the door, the neighbor's wife answered, and there was some kind of strange aroma that was coming from the home. But he thought it wasn't the kind of smell you get from cooking a steak, which inferred to me that these people were, again, cooking something else, some other type of meat that, would kind of feed into this belief that something strange was going on. And he also said that this neighbor and his wife were very small, and he began to think that maybe they were part of a group of bloodthirsty savages, people who might be cannibals, who might eat human meat. He told me later on in the interview that he also began to get the idea that because he believes their sewage systems connect, that perhaps his neighbor had been eating his own, I'll use a word different from what he used, but eating his own excrement, that when he would go to the bathroom and flush, somehow that would go up into his neighbor's home and his neighbor was eating that.
And he was experiencing that right before February 2nd?
Yes. Yeah, these were things that he was beginning to believe.
What else was he talking about?
Well, he spoke about what happened that evening, the Friday evening before the offense.
And that was when Jen Weed had come over to spend the weekend with you.
Yeah, Jen Weed came over that evening. He said before she came over, he had the drink with his neighbor, and he also had smoked some pot with his friend Greg Lindemood, and that felt the marijuana relaxed him. He felt very comfortable with his friend Greg. He wasn't feeling paranoid or feeling that Greg was some kind of hybrid. But that when Jen came over, he thought that maybe she was.
A hybrid?
Yeah, a pig hybrid of some sort. He said her ears looked kind of funny. And he began to think that maybe everybody around him, or many people around him, were this kind of strange hybrid. And he said what he was thinking, what was going through his head that whole night was about these people. He said he had concerns about and speculations about pigs and humans and hybrids. And I asked him, was this something you'd had, many times before? He said, no, this was what was occurring that week, and it was kind of building up. This kind of belief was new to him, is not like some other paranoid had when he was previously treated. He told me he went to bed early that evening, but he got up early the next morning. He said he had a lot of difficulty sleeping, hadn't really slept at all. And he made some coffee.
Now you're talking about
The Saturday morning of the offense. Yeah,
February 2nd, 2013.
right.
Okay.
He said he got up, it was still dark. He made breakfast. He made a breakfast of egg and bacon sandwiches. He made it for himself and Jennifer. And that he watched her consume a piece of bacon, even though she said she really wasn't hungry. He thought that was pretty weird.
Did she ate a piece of bacon?
Yeah,
Okay.
because he was thinking she was a pig hybrid. Why would you eat your own flesh or flesh of your people? And I asked him, he said they both got in the shower, and then he kind of spontaneously said to me, I wasn't expecting a tail or nothing. As if I was going to, ask him a question, did you expect her to have a pigtail? But he did say her ears looked kind of unusual, different than they'd looked before. It's kind of pointing out. And
They were in the shower?
yeah, and that her body looked kind of different. Her breasts looked askew, that she had changed in some way. And I asked her if he noticed anything else. And he said when she talked, he could see her tongue, which he thought was unusual. He hadn't noticed that before. And even after the shower, after they were both clean, he smelled this kind of smell. He called it a musk smell. It was disturbing to him. And he thought it was a different smell than she had ever admitted previously. And he also felt that it was kind of strange because she wanted him to stay in the shower even though he was ready to get out, and that he wasn't sure why that would be.
Did you, don't mean to interrupt you. They were taking a shower. Did you learn through your interviews that Eddie would go sometime without bathing?
Yes, that he would go sometimes many days without bathing, and so Jen was focusing on getting him showered when she saw him.
Is that typical of a person that has mental health problems?
Yeah, we see that quite a bit at Terrell. We might have somebody go a month or two without showering, and they get to be pretty ripe. People with schizophrenia frequently, aren't aware of the impression that they're making on others, and so they don't take care of the kind of basic hygiene needs that most of us just, take for granted. So yet,
Maybe dressing sloppily and not caring what they look like and not bathing would be some kind of sign of a mental illness.
it can be. I mean, that alone doesn't make the diagnosis, but that's consistent with the diagnosis.
So he's telling you about this morning and the shower What else did he tell you?
He said that they had that's the point where he told me about believing for some time that his neighbor was eating his excrement coming through the pipes. And he had the sense that maybe he'd been eating it the whole time. And then he told me that he and Jennifer had an argument about filling out this VA paperwork about the PTSD program in Waco. And I asked him at that point, I said, "Do you think you had PTSD?" And he just told me I had some kind of disorder. He told me that he told Jennifer that they were breaking up, but she wasn't accepting that. She wasn't accepting that he wanted to break up with her. And I did ask him if she wasn't hearing it because she was a pig, and he just said kind of, sort of. And
Did you know, or did he tell you, or did anybody tell you that he had proposed to her the night before?
he did not tell me that. I saw that in the documents, and also when I much later spoke with Ms. Weed, she told me that. And when I asked him during the interview, I asked him if he still thought she could be a pig, and he said he didn't think so anymore. He didn't think stuff like that anymore, the 14 months after I saw him. But he did say spontaneously, when I first got here to the jail, I thought I was going to be cooked for people to eat. So he had that kind of ongoing concern. He told me that morning he called his Uncle Jamie to come over, that Jamie said he would, and when Jamie arrived, Jen soon thereafter left, and he and Jamie smoked some whiskey. I'm sorry, drank some whiskey. And then when he told me when Chris Call came to his home, he was smoking cigarettes on the back porch of the house. He found it odd that Mr. Call did not introduce himself or even shake his hands. But
Did he tell you that he had smoked a bowl or two of marijuana with Jamie?
he told me later in the interview he did. As I was walking through it, he didn't spontaneously tell me that, but he told me later he had smoked some marijuana.
Okay.
He said when Chris Call did come over that he found it odd that Mr. Call did not introduce himself or even shake hands, and that they just went. He said that he thought initially they were maybe just going to go and talk somewhere, but he did remember they had said something about doing some other outdoor activities. And I think when he saw the guns in the vehicle, he was quite, he was aware of what that was going to be.
Okay. So at this point, he's starting to talk to you about getting in the truck with Chris Kyle and Chad Little, correct?
Correct.
How does he tell him? What does he tell you he feels like when he gets in there?
I don't know if I asked him what his emotion was as he got into the truck. He did say that one of the first things they did was stop at Whataburger.
Right.
And that seemed kind of weird to him because he didn't really want anything to eat. But Mr. Kyle told him, "You're gonna eat," and he ordered all three of them meals and a Dr. Pepper. And that, he felt he was sitting there eating his burger and drinking his Dr. Pepper, and he had this big pile of guns next to him, and he was feeling pretty nervous about that. Because it was kind of strange to...
Did he describe the guns to you?
He did not. No, he just said it felt weird to go do firearms with a group he hadn't met before. And I asked him why he was really nervous about that, and he said that he was still on his pig agenda. And later on in the interview, he kind of went back and he told me when he was at the Whataburger, he did say something to these gentlemen. He said he asked them, "Aren't you tired of eating people's shit?" And I asked him if he thought that they were pigs, and he said, "That's what I thought at the time." And then he told me that the odor that he had smelled at his neighbor's home was the same odor that he thought he smelled in Mr. Kyle's truck. And that it made him nervous. In his words, it made my hair stand up on the back of my neck. So at that point, smelling the same odor, it made him pretty anxious.
Okay. And What else did he tell you about, anything else about the ride?
He's-
Between Lancaster and Rough Creek Lodge?
He said that they didn't speak hardly at all. That he tried to keep up his end of the conversation, but nothing was said back to him, and that made him even more nervous. And he began to think to himself, this might be a one-way trip.
Those were his words, the one way?
Yeah, a one-way trip. I did ask him, because I had the information, whether he noticed they were texting at all, and he said he didn't notice that, but that he didn't notice that they were driving, he pretty fast. He got anxious, and he did remember that his girlfriend Jen had texted Chris, and Chris asked him if he wanted to talk to her, but she said, he told them he didn't want to talk and that they'd broken up. Asked what he thought about the fact that Jen had texted Mr. Kyle, and he said she thought she was bold to send a text to him like that.
Well, did he talk any more about the ride over there?
He said that once they stopped, he had to urinate. He urinated on the side of the road, and then when he got to Rough Creek Lodge, told him he had to urinate again. He got out and urinated on the side of the road, and he still thought it was strange that they weren't telling him anywhere about where they were going and what was going on. They didn't explain anything to him, and that as they drove apparently through the front gate and towards the main lodge area, he felt paranoid. He noticed there were two white cars that they passed, and that the white cars began to follow him. He began to think that both Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield were some type of pig assassins, the hybrid pigs sent here to kill people. So when they did stop the lodge, he also thought it was strange because while Mr. Kyle went in, Mr. Littlefield stayed in the truck, but they didn't say anything. He didn't say anything to him.
Well, let me ask you this real quick. Is it typical that he could recall the details of this trip?
Is it typical?
Well,
There's nothing about schizophrenia that keeps people from remembering things. I would think if he was highly intoxicated, he would have had difficulty remembering the details. Memory's really complicated, but we usually remember things the best when there's some type of emotional association with it, as long as we're not so overwhelmed emotionally. So it's why we usually remember, our first kiss, the first time we met our spouse, or something that really scared us, as long as we weren't scared out of our mind. So if he had a fairly high anxiety state, then it wouldn't be atypical that he would be able to remember, such a thing at all.
so he remembers stopping at the lodge and Mr. Kyle going in the lodge and he and Mr. Littlefield staying in the truck and no conversation.
Right,
That concerned him.
it did. He said that once Mr. Kyle got back in and got in the truck, they proceeded down the road to the range, and that he remembered Mr. Littlefield getting out and putting up a flag to let people know that the range was occupied, and then they went through a gate, closed a gate, and went to the last of three range areas in that section of the range. He said he asked them if he could help unload the guns, because they had a number of guns, but they still didn't say anything to him. And he said they took maybe 10 guns out of the truck, and parked the truck right near where they were going to be shooting from.
After they unloaded he didn't mention whether he helped unload the guns or not?
No, it didn't sound like he did, that they didn't say anything to him. I understood that to mean that he didn't unload the guns, that they just did it on their own because they didn't respond.
Well, after they unloaded the guns, what did he continue to tell you what happened?
He said that for the next 5 minutes or so, he loaded up a 9mm and did what he called slow fired at a silhouette target that was painted about 20 to 25 meters away, and that Mr. Kyle at that same time was shooting at a different target to his right. He thought about 30 to 40 meters away, but that Mr. Littlefield wasn't shooting at all, which
That concerned him?
he said that seemed, in his words, totally odd to him. He said that he knew that Mr. Littlefield had a pistol on him, but he wasn't shooting, so he thought that was really strange. He couldn't really make any sense of it.
So he knew that Mr. Littlefield had a gun on him.
Right. He told me that he felt like he was in danger and that something was going to happen, that he then fired at Mr. Littlefield and hit him in what he described as center mass, and that then he saw Mr. Kyle turning and he shot at him 2 to 3 times in the back and the upper torso, and that when Mr. Littlefield began twitching around, he shot him in the head, and that stopped the twitching.
Did he tell you why he shot Mr. Littlefield first?
I didn't ask him why he shot Mr. Littlefield first. He felt threatened by him. I asked him what he was thinking at the time, and he said he thought he'd neutralized the threat.
Those were his words.
Yes.
Okay, what else did he tell you after that?
That he thought, that's terrible. I've shot 2 guys. I asked him why he had shot Mr. Connell. He said he had a pistol in his hand. I was sure he was going to shoot me. I did ask him, why hadn't they shot you up to that point? They had guns. Why hadn't they done it, prior to that? And he said that he thought they were simply biding their time, that maybe there was a pond nearby, maybe there was a better place, a better time, that they could do this. Assassins pick their time. That's weren't his specific words. That's the way I understood him say. And I asked him why he thought they had given him a gun if they planned to shoot him. He just said, I have no clue.
Did he talk about leaving after the incident happened?
Yeah, he did.
How did he explain that to you?
He said that he didn't plan to steal the truck, but there were keys in the truck, and he stood over the bodies for about a minute, and he felt relieved. He felt he had done what he had to do, but he also was in shock. I asked him if he thought he'd made a mistake, and he did. He said, yeah, in the Bible it says not to kill anybody, but he also said that it was necessary when he shot them. I thought it was needed for the situation, to get out of the situation I was in. And I asked him if he thought others would have done the same in the same situation, and he said, I think some would and some wouldn't. It's a pretty shitty thing to do, to kill someone. I asked if he had simply thought about allowing them to kill him. And he said, no, absolutely not. I did, ask him whether he thought, other people would understand what he had done. And, he said he figured he would be arrested. He knew that you kill somebody, the police will look for you. But at the same time, he thought he did what he had to do. He was going to be killed, or he would have to kill them.
On his mind, he was under, at that point in time, he was under some kind of threat.
Yes, he was acting in self-defense to kill them before they killed him.
What else did he tell you about that day?
He said he went to his uncle's home in Alvarado. he told his uncle that he had killed 2 people. And I asked him what his uncle said, and he said he couldn't remember. He just wanted to talk it out with somebody, but he didn't really talk too much. And then head up the road to his sister's house in Midlothian, and he told her what he had done, and she told him, "You need to get the hell out of here." I asked him what he was thinking. He said, as soon as I did it, I knew I made a mistake. I felt like I was defending my rights, but after I killed him, I felt this isn't going to look good. I asked him what he meant, and he said it was either me or them. I didn't feel anything less. For the whole ride down there, I thought these guys might have been plotting before they got to my house. When I asked him why they would do such a thing, why would somebody come take you out to go shooting if they planned to kill you? He said maybe they hadn't gotten their fix in a while, like assassins need to kill people every so often.
Did you talk to him any about when he left his sister's house, where he went?
Yeah, he said he went to Red Oak. He was gonna try to go see his cousin, but his cousin wasn't there. Then he went to a Taco Bell to get some burritos. He said he figured he was gonna get arrested. He wanted to go ahead and get something to eat. He went back to Lancaster, went to his house, got his dog out of the cage and put her in the truck. Then he went to go look to the home of a Kevin Ramsey, who's a friend of his, to find out. He wanted to talk to Kevin to just talk it out, figure out what he should do. But Kevin wasn't home, and so he went back to his house, and he saw his neighbor out in front of his house, his neighbor Jesse. And Jesse tried to talk him into getting out of the truck. And I think this was about the time that the police were around.
You've seen that video the Lancaster police officer had, correct?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So he was talking to Jesse, his neighbor, with the Lancaster Police Department. He was sitting out in front of his house, correct?
Right.
In Chris Kyle's truck.
Correct.
Did he tell you what happened after that?
He said that Jesse got his mother on the phone, and his mother tried to talk him into getting out of the truck, and Jesse tried to talk him into getting out of the truck, but then he just left at a high rate of speed. He called that dumb. I asked him what he thought he should have done instead, and he said, I should have called the police from the range. That would have been a logical thing to do.
To call the police from the shooting range?
Yeah, from the shooting range. Yeah, instead of taking the truck and ended up in the high-speed chase and everything. He said once he got out of the neighborhood, he was being chased by the police, that he got T-boned by a police car, and then he headed out on to the highway, to I-35, and he said he was driving, in his words, ridiculously. He used the term reckless endangerment. And he said the police cars were following him, but then his truck finally simply gave out, and he stopped and put his hands out.
Did he tell you that he was subsequently taken to the Lancaster Police Department?
He said, I think that he was taken to the Erath County Jail the next morning. I didn't ask him specifically where he was taken right at that time, but that's my understanding. Was the interview was from the Lancaster Police Department.
Did he talk about the interview he had with Ranger Briley?
I don't remember if I asked him specifically about the interview with Ranger Briley. He did say that while he was in the jail, he thought some of the officers were pig people. But I don't remember specifically responding to any questions I posed about the interview with the Ranger.
Well, is that about it for y'all's discussion about the incident and the days leading up to it?
Yeah, that's about it.
And so, did you talk to or read some other reports of other people like Jen Weed?
Yeah, I did. I read a report from Ranger Briley, and I viewed the video that you guys have seen. And I listened to an audio tape of an interview with Jen Weed.
And you saw the video of the interview with Ranger Briley
Correct.
that was done on the night, about 11:30 at night, the day of February 2nd of 2013. You seen that?
That's right.
Dr. Gunn, based on everything that you viewed and read in your interviews, did you form an opinion about whether or not, when this particular offense occurred, whether Eddie was insane at the time he committed this offense?
Yes, I did form an opinion.
And you understand that in Texas, that at the time the conduct charged, that the definition is that he was suffering from a severe mental disease or defect, that because of that, he didn't know that his conduct at the time was wrong.
Yes, it's my opinion that at the time of the conduct charge, Eddie Routh was suffering from a severe mental disease or defect that prevented him from knowing that his conduct was wrong.
Okay. What do you base that opinion on?
Well, first, that he did have a severe mental disease.
And can you classify that or explain to us what it is?
I believe that Mr. Routh was suffering from schizophrenia.
Okay. And what are the symptoms or characteristics of schizophrenia?
I shared some of these with you before. To make the diagnosis of schizophrenia, you have to have certain symptoms or characteristics of the illness. He suffered from delusional beliefs that we discussed in detail. He also exhibited disorganized thinking. And I think that was exhibited probably best by the audio-taped interview, or videotaped interview with Ranger Briley, in which he was saying things that were frequently disconnected with the question that was being asked. Ranger Briley kept trying to focus him back in, on the question that was being asked, and didn't explore a lot of the things that Mr. Routh was saying, but he was going pretty far afield and saying stuff that simply didn't make sense about town squares and square towns and people sucking souls and chess pieces, just kind of all over the place. He also had, in that interview, and was described by family members as a, kind of restricted emotional response. We use the term affect, which is basically the perceived mood, the way people interact with each other. And he had a very kind of restricted affect or a restricted emotional response. To make the diagnosis of schizophrenia, you have to have two of the categories of illness: hallucinations, delusions, disorganized speech, disorganized behavior, or these negative symptoms of a restricted affect or avolition. Avolition means a little desire to do things, just kind of the social withdrawal that we frequently see in schizophrenia. While Ms. Weed had reported that he was hearing and seeing things the night before and that he had done that before, he didn't tell me of any hallucinations. So I didn't use that report to make the diagnosis of schizophrenia. But to make the diagnosis, I relied on the delusions, the clearly disorganized speech and thinking, and the negative symptoms or the flattened affect as well. So that's what led to the diagnosis. And I don't think it just started, that week of the offense. I think it probably started back in July of 2011 when he first had the symptoms of the tapeworm. And, we talked about the doctors at the VA being against him and the people there being against him, and, symptoms that began, probably around that time, just that they weren't there as prominently for 18 or 20 months, but that's probably when around the first time he had symptoms of the illness.
You talk in your report about malingering mental illness.
Yes.
Explain why you feel that you did not think that Eddie was faking or malingering mental illness.
Well, I spoke about that a little bit before, about how the type of symptoms that he described weren't what we normally see in an individual who malingers. His symptoms, his presentation was very consistent with what's normally seen in schizophrenia. And it wasn't this kind of dramatic, flowery stuff that you see in movies or cartoons. But also, I did the testing, the MFAS that I talked about earlier, that was not supportive of a diagnosis of malingering. I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence that he had a mental illness was not, my interview or my evaluation, but the text that Mr. Kyle sent at the time that Mr. Routh was in his vehicle.
Tell me why you think that's important.
Well, he was the one who saw him the closest to this event of anybody, and Mr. Kyle was used to seeing people who were a little bit strange, or people with post-traumatic stress disorder, people who were disturbed by the war, but he texts, this dude is straight up nuts. And, Mr. Littlefield is concerned enough that he says, watch my six. He knows that there's something wrong with the fellow sitting behind him. And it's not just PTSD. So I think that that's, pretty strong support for the idea that there was something really wrong with Eddie Ray Routh on the day of the offense. And that something wrong was a mental disease.
And as part of forming your opinion, did his interview with Ranger Briley play a significant part?
It did.
Why?
Because it was very supportive of the idea that, one, he had felt paranoid about these individuals, that he thought that he had to kill them or he would be killed, and that he had a mental illness at the time. The things that he said, the marked thought disorganization, the lack of emotional response, the kind of numerous bizarre statements about his thinking at the time. I killed him today. It wasn't a want to, it was a need to. I had to get out of there. Statements that he described them as imaginary headhunters trying to run everybody down. He drew a contrast between himself and Mr. Kyle and Mr. Littlefield by saying, I'm not trying to hunt everybody down for what they've done wrong. And when Ranger Briley asked him what was gone, he said, I can't just leave my soul up there. It's not what it's about. I've got people eating at my soul. So it was supportive both of mental illness and of this idea that he was in danger and he had to kill them before they killed him. Even the, excuse me. The very first statement he made to Ranger Briley is, I'm trying to find out more about the world that I've been living in too. I never knew I was in this deep. When I'm looking at those computer screens, when I was in Iraq, I never thought I was. I never thought it was. I was. I mean, you can look at it. It doesn't make sense to you at the time when you realize that's happening, you're looking like it's astonishing, He's trying to figure out the world. He's saying this stuff that's really bizarre. Briley is obviously trying to get him to, just talk about the offense. And he asks him these questions. He goes through a Miranda warning. And then immediately, Mr. Routh responds, I never knew that counsel was, maybe counseling between men and women needed to be more heavy in the world than it did. But when you're all surrounded by all fronts, where it begins, you just can't start in one place, And then immediately thereafter, Ranger Briley tries to get him to say again, tell me what happened. And he responds with, well, I keep talking to Chris, I keep talking to Chris's in the world. It seems like every time I talk to another man named Chris, I get sent to another man named Chris. I think about talking to the wolf, the one in the sky. I think about fighting through the war, The ones in the sky are the ones that fly, you know what I mean? The pigs in the world, they can truly say they're pigs. I've been smelling it this whole time. I'm just tired of everything. I'm tired of everybody's fucking bullshit. I can smell bullshit and pig shit, I can tell the difference between two different kinds of pig shit, two different kinds of pigs shitting. I don't know how you can smell your shit. I'm not saying nobody's shit's stinking, but shit's stinking, you know what I mean.
So that's kind of the continuation of several days of pig.
Yeah, it's totally non-responsive to what Ranger Briley was asking him, but it's clearly evident that he was having a mental illness, that he's having a lot of difficulty organizing his thinking, and that it pulls in a lot of the stuff that he, was telling me about pig hybrids and pig shit and other people's shit and a lot of stinking stuff. But Ranger Briley doesn't know what that means. I mean, Ranger Briley's got a job to do. His job is to try to, find out what happened and to see if he can get a confession. It's not to find out, does this guy have a mental illness that might have prevented him from knowing what he did was wrong. He does ask him, you knew what you did was wrong, didn't you? And at some point, Mr. Rowell says, yes, I did, which is what main defendants are going to say to the officers asking them questions. But the clear evidence of mental illness in the very initial responses in that interview, I think, are indicative of his state of mind at the time, are supportive of a mental illness, and are also supportive of the idea that he believed that he did what he had to do.
And he, in fact, through what you've reviewed, he not only told Ranger Briley that it was either him or them, he also told his sister that too.
Yes, he did.
That he had to get them before they got him. And I guess my point is through your interview with him and other collateral matters, that was his major fear, was that they were going to kill him.
He thought he was going to die if he didn't take care of business and kill them first.
And that would also not only show evidence of some delusional thinking, but in his mind, what he did was not wrong.
Correct. If you are going to be killed, then you have the right to defend yourself. He defended himself. In his mind, right. I'm not saying that's logical, but it was logical in his sense. He believed he was going to die. None of us would have thought that was the case. We thought that here's, a decorated war veteran and his friend taking out a guy who's been in the army to try to, relate to him and give him some, engage him in an activity isn't in what they're doing, really helpful thing. But in his mind, he thought he was going to die unless he took care of business.
Now, there's mentioned in the records of marijuana smoking, a habit of marijuana smoking, and so there's what we discussed earlier is a substance-induced psychosis, correct?
Yes.
What is your opinion about, at the time this offense was committed, whether or not his psychosis was substance-induced?
It's my opinion that his psychosis was not substance-induced.
Why not?
A lot of reasons. We know that he had been drinking some that day and he smoked a couple of bowls of marijuana. We know that he had been smoking marijuana and drinking for, years before that. Marijuana is smoked, latest figures from National Institute of Drug Abuse is that approximately 20 million people have smoked marijuana in the past year in the U.S. Marijuana doesn't cause this kind of psychosis. It simply, if it does, it's so incredibly rare as to be almost non-existent. We don't see this kind of marked thought disorganization without other evidence of intoxication in marijuana. He drove a car, various places. We know it was many hours after he'd smoked. The usual high will usually last between 2 and 3 hours. And certainly people, when they're acutely intoxicated on marijuana, have difficulty driving usually. But that intoxication, goes away usually in 2 or 3 hours. It doesn't continue into that evening, into the next day. For several more months after that, he reported he was still concerned about the pig hybrids. His belief that he was going to be killed, he said when I interviewed him in April 2014, that he still thought then that they were going to kill him that day if he didn't take care of business. He no longer believed that they were pig assassins, but he did think that they were going to kill him, that his life was in danger. So, but he did believe this stuff about the pigs for some time after. That's not marijuana. That's not a drug-induced psychosis. A drug-induced psychosis occurs during the period of intoxication. And even if he had been intoxicated on marijuana at that time, what he's representing, that thought disorganization with still, full kind of physical capabilities in terms of shooting a gun or driving a car, that isn't what marijuana intoxication looks like.
You have reviewed this morning his jail medication record, is that correct?
Yes.
And is Eddie been on antipsychotic medication? How long has he been on it since he's been in the Erath County Jail?
Since February the 3rd, 2013.
Until now?
Yes.
They're still prescribing antipsychotic medication.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. I'll pass it.
Good afternoon, Dr. Dunn.
Good afternoon.
You told us a little bit about your credentials, and you're a medical doctor, correct?
Correct.
You're a psychiatrist,
Yes.
and you do forensic psychiatry.
Yes.
And you understand what the legal definition of insane is in Texas under Section 801 of the Texas Penal Code, correct?
Correct.
I'm going to show you a couple of boards we have here, and I'll put these up here for you as well as the jury to see.
Oh, that's really a bad place.
Can you see where you are?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the correct wording of Section 801 of the Penal Code, correct?
Yes, it is.
That lays out the entirety of 801. The section deals with the insanity law.
Yes.
And then this one kind of breaks down what's in the wording of this, right?
Correct.
And you've probably heard this before. You can kind of break it down. There are 3 prongs to this insanity defense. Would that make sense to you?
Yes.
We look at the time of the offense, and that as a result of a severe mental disease or defect, the defendant did not know his conduct was wrong.
Correct.
And that's what a defendant would have to prove by preponderance of the evidence to be found insane, correct?
Yes.
And you know, as a medical doctor, that this is a legal definition, and it's not a medical diagnosis.
That's right.
And I'm sure you're familiar with this book, probably very well.
Yes, I am.
This is what the DSM, this is the 5 now, we're on the 5.
We are on the 5.
I guess back when this offense happened, we were on the 4 TR, is that right?
That's right.
And this is pretty much, not to sound blasphemous at all, but this is like the Bible for psychiatrists and psychologists. Everything about mental illness should be in here.
In terms of diagnosis.
Right.
Yes.
If there's any kind of disease or defect or mental illness, it's in here.
Yes.
And this definition over here of insanity doesn't appear anywhere in this book.
Correct.
Just to illustrate that this is medical and that's a legal definition.
Right.
So I know you get this. So, and then you understand that people throw around some phrases. In fact, I think Mr. Moore used the term that you are asked to go interview the defendant because something about him being not quite right. And I think even you yourself used the term crazy.
Indeed, I did.
And so you understand that probably all of us are guilty of throwing out terms like nuts and crazy and not quite right. And that might not mean, something as far as is somebody mentally ill.
That's true.
If I say I have a crazy mother-in-law, that might not mean she's got something in here and the DSM.
That's right, but she probably does.
With regard to that particular person, yes, you're probably right. But you understand, people throw those terms around.
They do.
People are not always politically correct when they're talking about the mentally ill.
That's right.
People are not always sensitive when they're talking about the mentally ill.
True.
And so, but you understand though as well, as a medical doctor and then being in the profession that you are, that just being mentally ill by itself doesn't necessarily mean automatically that they fall under that insanity law.
Absolutely correct.
So, I mean, there are lots of mentally ill people in the world that, for instance, they don't commit crimes.
True.
And there are a lot of people that commit crimes that are not mentally ill.
True again.
And there are people who are mentally ill, even have a severe mental illness, but they might not fit under that insanity law.
Absolutely.
So you have to have all the three things, right?
Right.
Just because we say somebody has a severe mental disease or defect, we don't say, well, that's the end of the inquiry.
Correct.
We have to get to that last one. Also, did he know his conduct was wrong? So,
That's right.
okay. And just because somebody's mentally ill doesn't mean that they can't experience feelings and emotions like non-mentally ill people. Is that correct?
That's true.
So if somebody's mentally ill, they wouldn't automatically be precluded from feeling what we might call normal human emotions, like, for instance, anger or sadness.
Absolutely.
Or they could feel fear, or they could feel jealousy, correct?
Certainly correct.
They could feel, they could have low self-esteem,
Absolutely.
or they could feel, narcissistic,
Yes, they can.
think very highly of themselves.
That's true.
Just depends. And so, I mean, people that are mentally ill could act and commit a crime due to some other motive other than their mental illness, couldn't they?
Yes.
For instance, somebody could be mentally ill, even severely mentally ill, but they could commit a crime, say out of, I don't know, greed.
It happens
Or-
all the time.
Or, jealousy, or they're mad at somebody.
Yes.
Let me talk to you about, so we have your report, and then you've reviewed some, have you reviewed other doctors' reports?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So you saw the defendant on April the 15th, 2014, right?
Yes.
Now, so were you aware that another doctor, Dr. Womack, had actually seen him 7 times before you visited with him?
I was not at that time.
Oh, you're saying just when you visited him, you weren't aware of that?
Correct.
Okay. So you know that now, though?
Yes.
And Dr. Womack had actually been to see him a few times, not just alone, but with the defense attorneys as well.
Yes.
Is that your usual practice, to interview a defendant with the attorney present?
Not usually with the attorney present. Sometimes the attorney will go in with me, introduce me, might be there for the first few minutes, but usually not. But on the few occasions where the attorney's been there, it's been the initial part to kind of get an introduction going.
Do you find that if you're doing an evaluation, if there's a third person there besides you and the defendant, that kind of changes the dynamic between the two of you?
I do that so rarely that I can't really tell you what the normal feeling would be.
Right. I mean, it's that kind of not the usual practice.
Right.
You'd probably have a better rapport with somebody if it was just the two of you.
It depends, on how well they trust that other person. So I can't really tell you yes or no.
If a third person is there and maybe they're making some sort of, what am I trying to say? So that maybe they have some kind of facial cue, or, they react to something someone says that might change the course of the conversation, wouldn't it?
Right. I understand what you're saying. So if I see somebody with a third person in my office, I have that third person actually sit behind the interviewee to make sure that that can't occur.
Right. Because say, for instance, if you were talking to someone and there was someone else there and they kind of, I'm not saying that this happened in this case, but like if there's a third person and they, either reacted positively or negatively to a statement, somebody rolled their eyes or they like got real wide-eyed or, something that might change the interaction between you and the defendant.
Sure, that could happen.
Let me talk to you about, you were talking about incompetency, that's something that you evaluate for
Yes.
in your practice. And that if somebody is, from the ethical rules for your profession, if someone is incompetent, then you're not allowed ethically to continue to evaluate them for sanity, right?
It depends on who has appointed us. If it is a court appointment, then no, we're supposed to stop right there. If it is an ex parte type evaluation, then we're ethically allowed to go forward, but we simply don't report anything out until the person might be found competent. So it's a little bit different.
But to your knowledge, Eddie Ralph has never been found to be incompetent.
Correct.
You were talking about different kinds of psychosis, right?
Yes.
And when the defendant went to the VA hospital, they would, several times, I think almost every time, they would classify it as what's known as psychotic disorder NOS.
That's correct.
Psychotic disorder not otherwise specified.
Right.
And isn't it true that psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, and when he was seeing them at the VA in Green Oaks back during 2011 and 2012, that was under the previous version, the DSM-4 TR.
Correct.
So, and that was a little different definition than it is now.
Right.
But the definition at that time of psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, isn't it true that it's it means there's inadequate information to make a specific diagnosis, or about which there is contradictory information.
Yes, that's the definition that was in the DSM-4.
And then there's situations, it says, in which the clinician has concluded that a psychotic disorder is present, but is unable to determine whether it is primary, due to general medical condition, or substance induced.
Yes. And
is it kind of your experience as a forensic psychiatrist that often when you see this psychotic disorder NOS, that means there's something else muddying the picture?
That can be the case. Most frequently when we see psychotic disorder NOS, though, in a clinical picture like a discharge summary, it's because initially when somebody was admitted, that's the diagnosis that was given by the resident, and then nobody took the time to try to clear up the picture. Oftentimes at the state hospital, when we have residents who are moonlighting, they'll start out with psychotic disorder NOS, and then I have to get a clarification what the diagnosis is. So sometimes it's a diagnosis of convenience. Sometimes it is a situation in which things are a little bit too muddy to figure out.
For instance, if there's intoxication kind of muddying the waters.
Yes, that can occur.
And do you also see this happen in your practice, that sometimes somebody says something and it gets repeated over and over in medical records?
Yes.
And so, for instance, if somebody said, PTSD by history, and that gets repeated over and over.
Yes.
That might mean, the defendant told them that.
It could mean that.
And then just got repeated throughout the records.
Yes.
Or somebody, a resident, somebody that maybe didn't spend a lot of time with the person says it's like psychotic disorder, NOS, and then it kind of gets repeated.
That can happen.
Kind of happens with medical records.
Yes.
Now, you were talking about different kinds of symptoms that you might see with psychosis and listed hallucinations. And then you talked about the different types of hallucinations, auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory. And I think you may have even said this. Auditory was the most common type associated with schizophrenia. Is that right?
It is the most common type.
Okay. And I think, though, then later in your testimony, toward the end, you said, though, Eddie Routh didn't have any hallucinations.
He didn't report any to me. Jennifer Weed reported that he admitted to those to her the evening before the offense.
Now, you understand, though, from her and everything else you've seen, he was smoking pot the night of the first, when you're talking.
Yes.
And let's see. So he first, went to the VA hospital in July of 2011, right?
Yes.
And that was that psychotic disorder, NOS,
Correct.
which might mean there's some intoxication at work there.
It can mean that.
In fact, in those records, doesn't it say that he was positive for marijuana?
Yes.
And then it also said in there in that entry that July 2011, possibly embalming fluid was reported in that marijuana.
Yes.
And so the way that was worded, it sounded like the defendant had told them that. Did you get that from those records?
Yeah, that at least he thought that could have been a possibility. I don't know whose initial suggestion that was.
And so did you see from those records that he actually had been working construction in Houston and working outdoors, and that kind of precipitated that whole incident?
That was what he was doing before he ended up in the hospital. Yes.
And then at that time, he had this what you called a delusion about the tapeworm.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think you said earlier that the tapeworm, actually, the delusion is a fixed false belief.
Right.
And I think you're right that is the easiest definition of anything in y'all's business. So it's a fixed false belief. It stays, for a long time.
That isn't what that means.
Okay. So it's easy to say, but it's not what it means.
No, I think I explained this before. Fixed means that it doesn't change despite evidence to the contrary. It doesn't mean that it necessarily stays for a long time.
Okay. So you interpreted, though, this belief that he had a tapeworm as a delusion.
Yes.
And the fact that he was working outside, he was dehydrated. I mean, are you totally discounting that he might have felt something physically was wrong with him from working at construction in the summer in Houston?
No, I think he absolutely felt that something was wrong with him. But instead of thinking that it was simply dehydration, he thought it was a tapeworm.
But I mean, you don't know, for instance, whether he had or didn't have some kind of gastrointestinal issue at that time.
That's correct.
I mean, you weren't there to look.
Thankfully.
Yes. And I mean, just because a doctor tests something and says, I mean, not to insult you because you're a doctor, but I mean, have you ever gone to a doctor and you feel like there's something wrong with you and they can't figure out what's wrong with you?
Personally, I haven't, but I understand that does happen quite a bit.
Right, and maybe you just believe, this doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. Or maybe you go to a different one.
That can happen.
You go to a hospital and they can't figure out what is wrong with you. Maybe the defendant just thought, this hospital is terrible. They don't know what they're doing. I still feel like I've got something wrong with me.
Or maybe he had a psychotic illness.
Right. So it could be either one. And at this time, they're saying psychotic NOS, not otherwise specified. Something else is kind of clouding the picture.
I understand that that's how that can be interpreted. I think that they simply weren't looking hard enough for that something else, which in my mind was schizophrenia, at least certainly by 2012.
But then they also said, they put down that he had a problem with cannabis abuse.
True.
And then he goes back in 2012 after the fish fry incident. And now that, I think, was the only hospitalization in which they didn't test him and he tested positive for marijuana. Is that right?
The 2012 incident, you're
Right.
saying he did not test positive for marijuana?
I think that's the only one where he wasn't tested. Is that right?
Green Oaks may have tested him. I can look at that.
But in general, though, almost every time he went to the hospital, he was positive for marijuana.
Yeah, and he was positive for marijuana I'm sorry, that's January 2013. You're right, I don't know about the September 2013 one.
But they also, during that visit, put down cannabis abuse was an issue.
Yes,
And that was the one, though, where, we have many witnesses that were there at the fish fry that testified he was very intoxicated.
my understanding was that he had been drinking most of the day.
And then probably smoking some marijuana, too, from what we've heard.
Yes,
Then we get to the January 2013 incident with the knife with Jen Weed and her roommate. And again, at that point, they put down psychosis, NOS, not otherwise specified, right?
right.
And he was, I think you mentioned, paranoid about the government, paranoid about some other things.
Yes,
Now, isn't it true that sometimes marijuana can make people paranoid?
acutely, yes, it can make people paranoid.
I mean, that's not unheard of.
Correct.
And then they prescribed some medication, and you mentioned risperidol. I think you said risperidol,
yeah.
Depakote, and hydroxyzine.
I'm just going to correct your pronunciation. I don't mean to be picky. It's Risperdal, and the generic is risperidone. So a lot of times people kind of combine those, end up with risperidol,
Risperidol is the name brand.
the brand name. Correct.
That probably is where I'm getting mixed up. Sometimes they give them the brand name, and sometimes they give them the generic.
Correct.
So risperidol or risperidone is the antipsychotic. That's the class of drugs. Is that right?
Correct.
And there are other uses for risperidol other than psychosis.
Yes.
It can be used as a mood disorder drug.
Yes.
And at lower levels, that's generally what it is used for mood stabilization.
The dosage for Risperdal for bipolar disorder and for schizophrenia is essentially the same. Different people or different doctors may use different dosing, but in terms of the studies that were done, the dosing range is the same.
But when you see somebody with a lower dose, is that kind of a clue? Well, maybe they're not taking it for psychotic symptoms. It might be for mood disorder.
No, not necessarily.
Are you aware that sometimes at jails around the state, they'll prescribe the class of antipsychotic medication actually as a sleep aid at a low dose?
Yes.
And now we were talking about this January 19th incident, and then you were talking about different types of drugs, LSD, PCP, meth, things that could cause hallucination and paranoia. What class of drug is marijuana?
Marijuana is considered a hallucinogen.
And you think you had said this, that sometimes meth users can almost, their appearance or their symptoms can mimic schizophrenia.
Yes, in acute intoxication, absolutely.
And if somebody like that comes into the hospital, you have to wait until they sober up to really make an accurate diagnosis. Is that right?
Somebody who's intoxicated on meth, yes.
Well, I mean, a lot of drugs. It's best not to make a diagnosis until somebody's sober.
Right.
For instance, I don't know if you know this, were you aware that the Waco program for the VA would not accept the defendant until he was sober?
When you say sober, do you mean like a month of sobriety, or do you mean not acutely intoxicated?
They wanted him to demonstrate a period of sobriety. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, that makes sense, but that oftentimes that's not because there's confusion about psychosis. It's simply that if somebody's still using drugs, then it's hard to say that they're really committed to recovery or able to commit to any kind of treatment program.
But I mean, does that kind of go along with the concept that if somebody has a drug problem, it's kind of hard to figure out and get to the bottom of their real problems if you're kind of obscuring something with a drug issue?
Well, I would agree with you that if somebody's acutely intoxicated, it's difficult to make the diagnosis. But about 50% of individuals with schizophrenia also have a substance abuse problem, and we give them both diagnoses. So the idea that, you wouldn't diagnose somebody with psychotic illness because they have a substance abuse problem just simply doesn't hold true in the real world.
And then, but I mean, it's better to have somebody not intoxicated and nothing in their system other than, I guess, what's prescribed for them to really make a diagnosis, an accurate
Right.
diagnosis.
It's hard to make any kind of accurate diagnosis during a period of acute intoxication. That's correct.
Now, we were talking about, you were telling Mr. Moore about marijuana, and you said the normal high from marijuana lasts 2 to 3 hours. Doesn't the literature say it's actually more like 2 to 4 hours?
I'll grant you that if that's what the literature says.
And it's dose related though too. It depends on how much marijuana somebody's taking in,
And how quickly they might metabolize it.
or how much they already had in their system when they took more in.
Right. I mean, it's acutely, but it's not the like if they smoked several days before, they're not still intoxicated. That part is an additive.
Right.
But if they've been smoking every 5 minutes, then it's the cumulative effect.
So chronic usage might affect that.
Yeah. Chronic usage in terms of like if they've been using for several days, what they smoked a few days ago isn't really going to affect their acute intoxication. But if you mean they've been smoking for, a bowl every few minutes, then yeah, that can increase how long they're intoxicated.
Okay. I want to talk to you about sort of you said you did this MFAS, this malingering test
Yes,
on the defendant. And, malingering is a psychiatrist's word for saying somebody's faking it.
that's right.
Somebody's playing crazy.
Not just crazy, but we have people who malinger mental retardation or malingering competency. Yeah, somebody's faking it, whatever the issue is.
And now, you understand that a forensic examination in that whole setting is different than if somebody comes to see you in your private practice and they're your patient and you're their doctor.
Absolutely.
Because if somebody is in a legal situation, they might have different motives than they have if they just come to see the doctor as a patient.
Yes.
And I mean, a lot of, I guess when we hear the term, garbage in, garbage out, your opinion is premised on that you have reliable data.
Correct.
That's right. And so the premise that we all have our self-interest in mind when we go to the doctor because we want to get better, we can't necessarily say that that's true when somebody is facing criminal charges and is having a forensic examination.
Well, they probably still have their self-interest in mind, but it may not be in line with what the legal system is trying to determine.
Right. So that might be a different situation where we assume that if somebody goes to the doctor and they're going there to try and get well, they're going to tell the doctor the truth because that would be in their best interest.
Yeah, if somebody's there just for treatment and they don't have any other ulterior motive, then you would hope that they're telling you the truth. Correct.
And so you understand certainly that if somebody is in jail and they're facing a capital murder charge, then they might have different motivations than somebody who comes to see you as a patient.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, you certainly understand that in the forensic setting, people lie to doctors.
They certainly do.
And now, before I get on to that too much, I was confused when you had said something in your report about that the defendant admitted, or you had some information about the defendant smoking marijuana the morning of February 2nd, 2013, because in your report, he denied that, didn't he?
He did, and I may have misspoke. I may have gotten that information from somewhere or something else. So when I was reading the report, you're absolutely right. He didn't admit to it, but I saw something or read something later that he had used.
Okay. And so when he's talking to you, he admitted to drinking whiskey and smoking marijuana the night of February 1st.
Correct.
Right. And then may have admitted to a little drinking the morning of February 2nd,
Yes.
but he denied smoking marijuana to you.
Yes.
Now, and you're aware now, though, that he's told other people that he did smoke marijuana that morning.
Correct.
And you're aware that his uncle James Watson has said that they smoked a couple of bowls from a pipe that morning.
That's my understanding.
And so what he told you about that was a lie.
Yes.
And when you met the defendant in April of 2014, I mean, that was the first and only time y'all met?
Yes.
Jail is kind of an artificial setting to have a conversation with somebody about their mental health too, isn't it? I mean, it's,
Where I hold a lot of my conversations with the mentally ill.
right. But you understand that there can be all kinds of things going on at a jail that might affect, I guess, the quality of data that you're receiving.
Yeah.
Stress,
Sure.
noise.
Yeah, although they really set us up nicely there. We had a conference room or library, and it was they're really accommodating.
But for instance, like I said, somebody facing a capital murder charge, a very serious charge, might affect the type of data that you get.
Yes.
I mean, you don't just go into these interviews saying, I'm going to assume that everybody's going to tell me the truth.
Right, which is the reason that we get a lot of collateral information beforehand, try to get medical records beforehand, things that we don't necessarily do when we see a patient in our office.
You were talking to him about PTSD and trying to decide if he really had that, right?
Yes.
And you know that he told several people that in Haiti, he actually cleaned up dead babies' bodies off the beach and put them in a mass grave.
I don't know if he told several people that, but that was something that family had reported that he said.
He didn't tell you that, though, did he?
No, he did not.
In fact, he said something like he might have seen a dead body, and that was about it.
Correct.
I mean, nothing about the dead babies.
Right, and I asked him directly about that.
And so that really wasn't true, that he had done that with dead babies.
Right, to my knowledge, that was not true.
And did you know that he actually, when he filled out an application for the VA to try and get money for some sort of disability, that he listed every single body part he had, even erectile dysfunction, to try and get disability?
I didn't know that, no.
I mean, that's not very honest, is it?
What did he say was wrong with all of his body parts?
There's something wrong with every one of them.
I don't know when he filled that out, but if it was during a period of psychosis like he was experiencing at the time of the offense, he may have believed that there was something wrong with every body part. That was certainly wrong. I don't know whether that was a lie or if that was wrong because of mental illness.
If it was right after he got out of the Marines in 2010, you don't see any evidence from the records that he was having any kind of issues
No, I don't.
back then. So that was probably just malingering to try and get some money.
Yeah.
You sat down with him and he told you, what you described to the jury about your interview with the defendant.
Yes.
And he told you something about the pig people and the hybrid pig people and pigs are taking over the earth and all that kind of thing.
Yes.
Now, were you aware that the defendant in his past had gone feral hog hunting?
No, I didn't know that.
Did you know that, or have you ever heard a phone call 4 days before you interviewed him in which he's talking to his mother about watching a TV show called Boss Hog?
No,
Have you ever seen that show, Boss Hog, on the Discovery Channel?
I have not.
Did you know that it was about a character known as Pigman?
I did not.
Did you know it's about a man who goes out and kills feral hogs and sells them to a barbecue joint?
No, I didn't know that.
And did you know that they have on there all about Pigology 101 and all about how to catch pigs and trap them and sell them to the barbecue place? And
No, I did not know any of that.
so you hadn't heard that call on April 11th, 2014, where he's discussing watching that show.
No, I had not.
He also talked to you about some paranoia about his neighbor,
Yes.
thinking that he was with the Mexican mafia, maybe involved in some kind of illegal activities or something like that.
Yes.
And you understand that this is the neighbor that is the police officer
Yes.
with Lancaster Police Department. right?
Yes.
And now, have you also heard that often the defendant and his family would go out on the back porch and smoke marijuana out there?
I knew that he smoked with his family. I didn't know where they smoked.
I mean, can you imagine that somebody who, you said earlier, marijuana sometimes can make people paranoid.
Correct.
So you're smoking marijuana and your next door neighbor's a cop. That might make somebody a little paranoid about that person.
I think if they were really paranoid, they would smoke inside.
You'd think so, but.
Yeah.
And then he also had some, I guess, issues with, is it the other neighbor with the funny cooking smell?
I'm not sure which neighbor was he. So I don't know if it was the neighbor who was the officer or a different neighbor.
It was another Hispanic neighbor, though, or a Hispanic neighbor.
Yes.
Right. And he said it didn't smell like they were cooking steak.
It was a short neighbor who had a short wife. So I don't know if that describes the Lancaster officer or not.
I mean, it's very possible that they're cooking something that he's not familiar with.
That is possible.
Some sort of ethnic food that he may not regularly eat.
Yeah, I don't question that. I think it was his interpretation of what that might have been that was so evident of mental illness.
And I think actually you said that he called them, savages or something. Actually, his word was pygmies, wasn't it?
I don't know if I've seen that he spoke about pygmies. I don't know if he used the term pygmies. I'll have to refer to my report, but I don't think that was the term he used with me.
He might have used that with somebody else.
Very likely, yes.
And you don't know these people, right?
I do not.
You don't know whether they really are short people or not.
I assume that they are short people from his description, but I don't know.
Now, it's kind of a common theme throughout his interview with you and some other people. He sometimes makes some disparaging comments about people that are not white, right?
He does, yes.
And often his, the people that he claims to have some sort of, issue with are Hispanic or not white, right?
Absolutely.
So his neighbor that he thought, he's in the Mexican mafia. And then the co-workers are Hispanic, right?
Correct.
And he thought that their food looked funny to him.
Yes.
But he kept going to work, even though he was having these issues, these
Yes.
concerns about the coworkers. He said he kept going to work because he needed the hours.
That's what he told me.
Have you heard of something called negative symptoms when somebody has schizophrenia?
Yes, that's what I was speaking of when I talked about the flattened affect and the decreased socialization. Those are part of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia.
And often somebody that might be experienced schizophrenia and having those negative symptoms, they would just not even go to work.
Sometimes, although it's more of a kind of decreased social interaction, oftentimes the people who don't go to work because of mental illness is more due to severe depression. They don't have the energy or the wherewithal to do so. But I'll grant you there may be certainly people with schizophrenia and negative symptoms who may decide that they're not going to go to work anymore. That can happen.
Right. It's kind of an amotivational
Right.
disease. You tend to want to just, avoid people, just stay home.
Yes,
But he was going to work regularly.
he was.
And in fact, his boss even dropped him off at his house at 4:00 on the evening of the February the 1st.
I didn't know that.
Okay. So he was going to work from the time he got out of the VA hospital until February 1st, and his employer even dropped him off that day. So you didn't know that, though.
No, I didn't.
And did you know that she said he seemed fine? I mean, maybe he was a little down because his mom was going out of town that weekend, but she didn't notice anything unusual about him that day.
No, I didn't know what she thought about him.
And you've certainly never met these coworkers of his.
I have not.
You were talking about that auditory hallucinations would be the most common type of hallucination associated with schizophrenia, right?
Correct.
Aren't olfactory smelling hallucinations, wouldn't that be more common with either drug abuse or some kind of organic problem?
Most common with a seizure, actually. And I don't know about the drug problems, how frequently olfactory hallucinations occur, so I really can't respond to that but certainly auditory hallucination is the most common hallucination in schizophrenia. And visual is the next.
Now, he was talking though about smelling smells and, smelling, weird smells at the neighbors and, Jennifer smelled musky and smells in the truck and that kind of thing. That's quite rare for that to be associated with schizophrenia, isn't it?
Again, that's not the most common hallucination, an olfactory hallucination.
And like I said, he didn't report any kind of visual or auditory hallucination.
Right. I guess what I don't know, and we don't know for certain, is whether those were all smells and he was misinterpreting those smells, or whether that was some unique hallucination. It's quite possible that there were smells. He just, instead of interpreting it as the Whataburger smell from cooking meat and onions, he interpreted it as something entirely different.
And certainly, isn't it true that marijuana heightens your sense of smell?
I don't know.
You haven't heard that from the literature.
No, I'm not aware of that. I know it makes time seem to go more slowly, but I don't know about the smell. It certainly reportedly increases appetite quite a bit.
Kind of heightens the senses in general, though.
I don't know about all the senses, and I'm not aware of the report about smell.
So he reports those smells a lot, issues with smelling things, and he said that he thought the co-workers were going to put him on the rotisserie, and then people at jail were going to do that too once he got there.
The people at jail might eat him, and that the people at work might eat him, and that the light itself was a rotisserie.
And so you've been over to the Erath County Jail.
Yes, I have.
And you're aware that it's right next door to the Heart 8 barbecue.
I wasn't checking out the restaurants.
But do you know you can smell the barbecue place over at the jail?
I didn't know that, no.
I mean, if you go down that street, you can go on the way out and see.
I trust you.
And so your report doesn't contain anything in there about the defendant admitting that he used marijuana on the morning of February the 2nd.
That's right.
Because he didn't tell you about that.
That's
In
correct.
fact, he lied to you about that and said he didn't.
That's right.
And you were talking about Whataburger and smells and stuff. And so you said that the defendant told you that they went to Whataburger and he said something like, "Aren't you tired of eating other people's shit?"
Yes,
I mean, most people would interpret that as an odd statement, right?
I would hope so.
And would maybe make somebody make a comment like, "This guy's nuts."
That might be a response,
I
yes.
mean, many of us, if we went to Whataburger with somebody and they said, "Aren't you tired of eating everyone's shit?" you might text your friend and say, "This guy's nuts."
That's a possibility.
And again, these are terms that people throw around and they're not politically correct, but we do it.
Yes,
And maybe it's not sensitive or entirely accurate.
that's right.
I mean, certainly Chris Kyle didn't have any kind of background in psychology or psychiatry.
Correct.
So we don't really know what he meant by "this guy's nuts."
We don't.
It could be that he just said that weird comment at Whataburger
That could be it,
or something similar.
perhaps.
Now, then the defendant told you as well that when they're in the truck going to Rough Creek Lodge, his girlfriend Jennifer had texted Chris,
Yes,
and he thought this was very bold of her to do that.
yes.
Is it possible that he was a little bit jealous of that?
Possibly.
He had to urinate at least twice, and that meant what? He was nervous or something.
One could, hypothesize that he was nervous if he urinated twice on the drive.
I mean, alcohol is a diuretic, right?
Indeed it is.
And sometimes people just have to urinate for different reasons.
That's right.
Either they're, ingesting some kind of diuretic, or they're just nervous about something,
Yes.
like being on the stand.
Yeah, that can make people nervous.
And he told you that they were not talking to him on the way out to Rough Creek Lodge.
Correct.
And sounds like from the context of it, that irritated him.
I couldn't tell that he's saying that irritated him. I think that made him nervous.
And irritated him or made him nervous that Chad was not shooting?
Yes, he was puzzled by that and concerned.
Now, I think you may have misspoken. You said that he knew Chad had a gun. In fact, he told you he was pretty sure Chad had a gun. Is that right?
Yes, those were his words. Pretty sure.
And then now he told you that he shot Chad center mass, were his words.
Yes.
Did he tell you that he shot Chad in the back?
He did not tell me that.
He should tell you that he shot Chad twice in the back.
No, he did not tell me that.
Did he tell you that he shot Chad in the face?
He told me he shot him in the head after he was moving around.
Okay, so after Chad's already down, he told you that he shot Chad again in the head
Yes.
because he was moving around.
Yes.
And did he tell you that he shot him in the top of the head?
I don't think I asked where in the head he shot him.
Did you know that he shot Chad in the back of the head too?
From the autopsy report.
But the defendant didn't tell you that.
No.
He said that he wanted to neutralize the threat.
Correct.
And on that subject, I think you had said, something about his action. He was acting in self-defense, is what I heard you say.
Yes.
Now, you're certainly familiar with this definition out of the penal code. Are you also familiar with what's required under Texas law for somebody to be able to claim self-defense?
I'll give it my best shot. You have to have an honest and reasonable belief that your life is in danger or that you're going to be, undergo serious bodily injury or something to that effect.
Right, you got the part. It has to be a reasonable belief.
Yes.
And so somebody having an unreasonable belief is not self-defense under Texas law.
No, that's mental illness.
Right. So it's not, he can't claim self-defense. You understand that?
I understand that.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, we understand you have to get to this third prong too. We don't just end by saying, oh, okay, well, he's schizophrenic. According to your diagnosis, that's the end.
I understand.
We need to get to, did he know what he did was wrong?
Correct.
So I want to go over with you some of the things that he said to you about the offense. He said to you, he said, I just shot two guys. I thought that's terrible.
Right.
Thinking that's terrible, doesn't that indicate some level of remorse?
Or that's terrible. I had to shoot two guys. You can feel bad about something that you've done that you had to do, and you can have remorse about something that you had to do.
Well, let's talk about some other ones. He said, well, I guess you asked him if it was a mistake, and he said, in the Bible, it says not to kill anybody. So does that demonstrate that he understands a moral sense of what's wrong and what's right?
That indicates that he does know that in general it's wrong to kill people.
Right. So he's, I guess, familiar with the Bible and has some sense of morality.
Yes.
And knows what would be wrong according to the Bible.
Correct.
He also said it's a pretty shitty thing to do to kill someone. So that indicates that he knows killing people is bad and wrong.
Yes, separate from if you think they're going to kill you, but certainly it's not a good thing to do.
But he said also he figured that he'd be arrested. So he knew that he was doing something that was illegal, right?
He knew that what he was doing would be viewed as illegal, that the police would come after him. There's no question in his mind that the police were going to come after him.
Right. So he knew that. In fact, that's why he stopped and got a burrito, got two burritos at Taco Bell, because he knew he was fixing to get arrested.
Last meal, yes.
I think we can agree it was a pretty pitiful last meal, but he knew that he needed to get something to eat because he was fixing to go to jail.
Yes.
Now, let's see. And he said, this isn't going to look good.
Correct.
Meaning he knew that other people would not think it was a good thing for him to do.
Yes, people who didn't know the circumstances wouldn't think it was a good thing to do.
So sort of I guess it would be socially wrong or societally wrong.
Well, that, again, people who didn't know what had happened or didn't know why he did it would think it was a bad thing.
And so he's admitted to, he knows he's going to get arrested. Now, he fled too. He fled the scene.
Correct.
I think he actually, though, didn't use that word with you, right? He just said he left.
Yeah, I don't know that he used the word fled.
I mean, if you're fleeing a scene of a crime, doesn't that indicate that you pretty much know, I got to get away from here? There's something wrong here. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Well, like I said, he certainly knew that the police were going to come after him.
Right. So he knew. So he fled the scene and he went 105 miles. We've heard testimony. That's how far it is
I'll trust you on that one.
from Rough Creek Lodge over to Lancaster. So let's look at some of his actions too, and not just what he said that he did. Do you know that he reloaded the 9mm before he left the scene? Before he
Yes.
fled the scene at Rough Creek Lodge? I mean, he armed himself.
Yes.
And he didn't call the police during the whole fleeing from Rough Creek over to Lancaster.
That's correct.
In fact, when his sister told him, I'm going to call the cops on you, he left her house.
Yes.
And in fact, he told his sister that he was in too deep and he was going to run to Oklahoma.
Right.
I think he said he's going to run to Oklahoma to get out of this mess.
I don't have those words, but that sounds reasonable.
Somebody said, I'm going to run to Oklahoma to get out of this mess. I mean, that implies that they know that they're in a mess.
Right. He knew that the police were going to be after him.
And so he knew that what he had done would be viewed as illegal.
He knew that what he had done would cause the police to be after him. He was going to have to explain to them why he had to do it.
Now, what's your understanding of what in Texas wrong means?
Well, by case law, it's that the individual knew that it was illegal.
And so, I mean, you kind of understand the theory behind that is who gets to decide what's wrong and what's not, right?
Yeah, it's been, obviously in different states that this is worded differently.
But here, let me just hang with me for a minute. I mean, there are people who might have different moral beliefs than, say, 99% of us.
Yes.
For instance, somebody might think that it is morally right and in line with their religion to take 20 people out onto a beach and cut their heads off.
Yes.
And that would not be in line with most of our moral and religious beliefs.
Correct.
There are people who believe that it's morally right and it's the right thing to do to shoot the abortion doctor at the clinic.
Correct.
But that would be viewed by most everybody else as not the right thing to do.
Correct.
And so you understand that, I guess, we got to define what's morally or socially or legally wrong, right?
Yeah, that was,
We got to have some standard.
yes. And
And people don't just get to pick, well, I think it's the right thing to do to, put a bomb in my underwear and get on a plane.
right, we don't have an independent moral standard.
Right. And so people don't just get to decide for themselves, I think this is right, therefore it's okay under the law.
Correct.
And I mean, think of this. Every time someone pulls the trigger and shoots somebody intentionally, they want that person dead at that moment, right?
If they're shooting for the vital organs of the head. Right.
If you shoot somebody 7 times, in the back, in the head 3 times, in the hand, we can pretty much assume you wanted that person dead.
Yes.
I mean, and say, for instance, if I found there was some woman and she was messing around with my husband and I just decided she deserves to die and I shoot her, I want her dead at that moment.
Assuming you're shooting her in the vital organ. Right.
And at that moment that I'm doing it, I probably think, she's got it coming. She deserves this. But it doesn't mean that I'm right.
Correct.
Okay. And so you see where I'm going with this. We don't just get to decide for ourselves, well, I feel like I'm in the right, so therefore.
Right. We don't make our own individual moral standards.
Right.
And kill.
So we have to look at, we have to have some, I guess, bright line rule of how do we determine what's wrong.
Society wants that, yes.
Now, I think you said in your report, the defendant has, no, I got ahead of myself here. Things that he did. Didn't call the police, right?
Correct.
And he went to Taco Bell.
Yes, he did.
In fact, did you actually hear from some other source that he, before he went to Taco Bell, went to the dollar store and tried to get a Dr. Pepper?
I heard that, yes, from some other source. That's correct.
He went to, I guess, to see his uncle and his sister.
Yes.
I guess ostensibly to say goodbye to him.
Well, it sounded like actually he wanted to tell them what he had done, wanted to kind of talk out what he had done.
But he was going to then run after that.
Right, he wasn't going to stick around for the police.
And then he had that standoff with the police outside his house in Lancaster.
Yes,
And he knew why they were surrounding him.
he absolutely did.
He knew that they had guns.
Yes,
He knew that could end up very badly with him getting shot.
I assume he knew that, yes.
He knew he was in trouble at that point.
He definitely knew he was in trouble.
And he knew that if he stayed in that car, he could kind of hold it off and prolong any kind of consequences.
That's correct.
And then he fled from that scene too,
He did,
with the police chasing him.
yes.
No doubt he knew that the police were chasing him because there were so many of them.
He definitely knew that.
And he fled really fast.
Yes,
And he even recognized later that was reckless endangerment to other people when he did it.
yes,
And then when he got stopped, when the truck just kind of gave out, and he had to get out of the truck, he came out with his hands up.
yeah, I didn't see that part, but he told me he put his hands out first.
Okay, if we've all seen that video where he comes out with his hands up and he complies with demands and he lies down on the pavement, is that in line with what you know to have
Yes.
happened? So he knew this is what you're supposed to do when you get pulled over by the cops.
Yes,
So when he's talking to you about committing the killing of Chad Littlefield and Chris Kyle, he's talking about being out there at Rough Creek Lodge, and he said that he never expressed anything that either one of them did, any actions they took that the rest of us would perceive as a threat.
correct.
This was just what he's thinking.
Yes,
He never said that Chris or Chad tried to grab his gun.
correct.
In fact, they gave him a gun to shoot with,
They did.
and he actually did shoot with the gun.
He did.
He's talking about shooting at a target 25 to 20 meters away, and then Mr. Kyle was shooting at another one 30 to 40 meters away, right?
Yes,
So this implies that Chris is able to shoot at a target further away than the defendant.
well, that's what they were doing at the time. I don't know what their abilities were, but obviously Mr. Kyle had considerable abilities in that regard.
Is it possible that he felt a little jealous about Chris Kyle's skill compared to his?
He didn't say that. In fact, he told me that he was an expert marksman. His training was better than Mr. Kyle's. So
Okay.
it seemed the opposite almost.
He's at times shown you a little bit of narcissism, hadn't he?
Well, he puts down other people, and he, thought highly of himself in terms of his training. But I wouldn't say that, the overall story that he told me was really one of narcissism, which he was expecting to be, overly appreciated by other people, or that, he, felt like other people were supposed to kind of look up to him, that kind of thing. Not in general, but I would say that those things that you mentioned, certainly that could be interpreted as being
Kind of
narcissistic.
bragged about his expertise as a rifleman and a
Yes.
sharpshooter, and said that he waited, I guess, to the opportune time to shoot the two of them.
Yes,
And I guess kind of, the way it's worded, it almost sounds like he's kind of bragging about that.
he was. Yeah,
Waited.
he had a talent. That he picked the right time to shoot.
In fact, did he tell you that he waited until Chris's gun, it was spent, that he'd fired his last shot?
I think I heard that in some other audio tape. I don't think he told me that.
But he told you that he shot Chad first, right?
Yes,
shot him center mass, but he didn't tell you that it was in the back.
No, he did not.
Didn't tell you it was in the head, except when he said,
Sustained.
there's nothing that he told you that Chad was doing that would necessitate him shooting Chad in the head while he was already down on the platform of the shooting range.
Just that he was still moving.
And he admitted, though, that they had given him his own gun to shoot with.
Correct.
Then later made these comments about it was a pretty shitty thing to do to kill someone.
Yes.
And the Bible says not to kill.
Right.
And I knew I made a mistake.
He said that.
And after I killed him, I felt this isn't going to look good. For the record, you said you had done, I guess, an evaluation to see if the defendant had post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD.
Yes, I did.
And is it your opinion that he does not have PTSD?
That's my opinion.
Because he actually, according to your determination, you have to have a T in your PTSD, right?
Gotta have the T.
You got to have some sort of trauma that would cause you to have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And there was nothing about his military record or what he told you about it that would cause you to believe that he had any kind of significant trauma that would cause PTSD.
That's correct.
So that's kind of a myth that's come up around this case, that he has that.
Right. It's my opinion that he does not suffer from PTSD.
And then so it looks like, so you actually questioned him about the report that he had seen dead babies floating in the water.
Yes.
And because he had told other people that in his family.
Yes.
Okay, so that was a lie.
Again, it may depend on when he said it. It's possible that when he said it, that was part of his mental illness. If he said that long before 2011, then I'll grant that that was a lie.
The only thing he told you was, I'm pretty sure I saw a couple of dead bodies.
Right.
But I couldn't really tell for certain.
Right.
And we were talking at the beginning, I mean, there's nothing about mental illness or even schizophrenia, a severe mental illness, that would preclude the defendant from being able to feel other emotions, right?
That's true.
I mean, he could feel jealousy.
Yes.
He could be jealous that Chris Kyle was famous and he's not.
He could be.
He could be jealous that Chris Kyle was a very skilled marksman.
Yes.
He likes to brag about his own skills as a marksman, but it could be that he's jealous that Chris is even better.
That's possible.
Jealous that Jen Weed called Chris.
Yes.
He can feel angry at people, right? There's nothing about any kind of mental illness that precludes him from being able to feel angry.
True.
He could be angry that Chris didn't shake his hand.
Yes.
Or Chad didn't shake his hand.
Yes.
I mean, he mentioned that they didn't shake his hand.
That's right. He did mention that.
Seemed kind of bothered about that.
He was perplexed by that.
And then it's possible that he could be angry that Chad came along and he didn't know who Chad was.
It's possible.
Like, who was this other guy on my mandate with Chris?
I guess that's possible.
I mean, I'm not saying that in any kind of, homosexual connotation at all, but you know what I mean. It's two guys going out to have some fun outdoors. And is it possible that he resented this third wheel coming along?
I guess that's possible.
And is it also possible that he was angry that they didn't talk to him on the way down there?
Yeah, it didn't come across as anger. It came across more as being, more paranoid, puzzled, worried. But I guess anger could be part of it.
And, I mean, you're aware that he told an officer that he killed them because they wouldn't talk to him.
That's my understanding.
Could it be possible that he was just angry at some minor thing that happened along the way?
He could have been angry about a number of things.
Have you heard that he angered easily?
Yes.
You've heard from people and read reports he has a very short temper.
Yes.
In fact, if Jen Weed had said that he would get mad over little things like spilling a beer.
Yes.
And so angry he'd throw a shoe across the room.
Yes.
Or have road rage.
That's certainly believable.
And he had some reason to be angry about his life in general, right?
His life wasn't going the way he had hoped.
He was having a hard time finding satisfying employment, right?
True.
Living with his parents at age 25.
Yes.
A lot of people would be angry about that.
Yes.
Angry that he'd broken up with Jen that morning.
did not sound as if he was angry about having broken up.
He kind of sounds like to you, he kind of minimized their fight.
He told me that he told me that they broke up. What he hadn't told me was that they'd gotten engaged the night before.
Did he tell you that she got mad at him for dipping snuff and threw a snuff can away?
She told me that.
And did you know that then he told her to get the F out of the house and told her to go eat a peanut and die, and they had an argument about that?
She told me that, yes.
And so it's been a while since I've been, in my 20s and broken up with somebody. In fact, it's been longer than that because I've been with my husband for so long. But people that are in that age, they're in their 20s and young love and all that, that's a pretty big deal if you break up with somebody, isn't it?
Yeah, breakup can be a big deal.
It can be a very, it can affect people's mental state if they have a breakup with somebody that they're in love with.
Yes.
And it might cause them to do things that they might not do otherwise.
Yeah.
Other emotions that he's certainly capable of having is he can be offended by something somebody does, right?
Sure.
He could be offended that they didn't shake his hand.
That's possible.
Instead of angry, maybe he was offended.
Yes.
He could be offended that they didn't talk to him.
That's possible.
He could be offended that Chris and Chad seem to be communicating with themselves, but not him.
Yeah, although he wasn't aware they were texting, so it didn't seem like he was aware of that.
But I mean, if they had kind of a nonverbal communication or kind of an understanding between the two of them, he could be offended at feeling left out of that.
That's possible.
And he could also be offended that Jen Weed was calling Chris or texting him.
They use the term bold.
Thought it was bold of her to do that.
Yes,
And that could be, he could be offended by that.
possibly.
It's also possible that he could have the emotion of having a low self-esteem, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's possible that you can see glimmers of narcissism and also somebody has a low self-esteem, right?
Yeah, you can see that. A lot of times those people end up getting depressed because the world doesn't treat them as special as they think they should be treated.
And in fact, did you see in the records that the defendant was resentful or upset that people didn't treat him as special as he thought he should be treated after he got out of the Marines?
Yeah, in terms of like he should have gotten a better job and that kind of thing.
Right, and that bothered him.
Yes.
He could have a low self-esteem because he was living with his parents at age 25.
Yes.
Had this weird little car, this VW Beetle painted like a ladybug.
Yeah, I didn't know what kind of vehicle he had.
He could have low self-esteem because he, didn't have a lot of nice clothing.
Possibly.
Low self-esteem because he's sleeping on an air mattress because the dog ate his mattress.
I guess so.
When you got to bring your girlfriend to your mom's house and sleep on an air mattress, that might cause some people some esteem issues.
It could. I didn't get that report from him, but I guess that's possible.
Is it also possible that he wanted to feel important?
Yes. Yeah.
Maybe wants some notoriety.
I did not get the sense that he was going to kill somebody for notoriety, but certainly he, would have been helpful for him to feel important.
I mean, if you kill somebody known as the American Sniper, it might make you feel important.
Yes, that's possible.
And then you talked about a little bit of narcissism, him saying things like, my training was better.
Yes.
And that's how he kind of got the drop on these two guys.
I think that was not narcissism. I think that was actually psychosis.
But I mean, there's nothing in any kind of mental illness that he has that would prevent him from also feeling narcissism.
That's true.
And he could just be mad at the world in general.
Yes.
I mean, there's some people like that. They just have a bad day and they're just mad at the world, mad at everybody.
Yes.
And, get out of their way.
Right.
That happens. He didn't particularly like the VA, did he?
No, he did not.
Didn't like the doctors there.
There were some doctors that he certainly didn't like. Although when he went to Green Oaks, he would ask to go to the VA, so he preferred the VA over another psychiatric hospital. But he complained that he didn't get what he wanted out of the VA.
Well, and he also sometimes had a problem with the foreign doctors there.
Yes,
So you're saying in your report that you don't think voluntary intoxication plays any part in this offense?
no, not in terms of the offense or his or my belief that he didn't know what he did was wrong.
But again, when you wrote this report, he had lied to you about using marijuana the morning of February the 2nd.
True, but that information does not change my opinion,
The fact that he would lie to you about that doesn't.
or the fact that he smoked marijuana. No,
Well, the fact that he would lie to you about that, does that, and then you've heard this about the Boss Hog show. Does that make you question anything about what he told you about the pig people?
no,
You still think that's not malingering?
correct. I think that's not malingering.
Okay, the fact that he hadn't told anybody that about the pig people until, were you aware that he told Dr. Womack that a week before you saw him?
They told Dr. Womack about pig people. No, I wasn't sure about the timing.
And he hadn't told Dr. Womack anything about pig people until a week before you saw him.
No, I didn't know.
And then in between that first report of the pig people, he's watching this show about Boss Hog and the guy named Pigman.
You need to remember, though, in the interview with Officer Briley, he's talking about pigs and pig shit. And so what he told me in April 2014 was consistent with what he said on the day of the offense.
Well, I mean, you've heard that sometimes people call police officers pigs.
Yeah, that was not what he was saying.
Right. But I mean, if Jen Weed said that sometimes he would refer to cops as pigs,
Yeah,
that could be it.
that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, he throws around terms like pig shit and bullshit and, I can smell the shit. He says stuff about that a lot.
I don't think he's throwing that around. I think that that's part of what he was thinking at that time. I think that's a window into what his belief system was.
Well, and you've heard him talk, and you've met with him for 6 hours. I mean, he has sometimes some rather odd way of phrasing things, doesn't he?
The oddness of his phrasing was much more acute around the time of his, more significant psychotic symptoms. You look at the Green Oaks records and talks about him talking about in metaphorical ways, just kind of going off into the ether, the things that he's saying. You look at that interview with Ranger Briley, and he's going everywhere with the square towns and the town squares and the soul sucking and the pigs and I'll say excrement this time. And when he spoke with me, he was much more focused in the interview. He was much less symptomatic. So I think he was certainly, much more ill around the time of the event.
You were talking about earlier about people who are schizophrenic. Sometimes, they look like you and me. You said that, right?
Yes.
But you're talking about people that or have experienced at the hospital. But you had said sometimes if you get up close, they might be talking to themselves or something.
Yes.
And sometimes people who have schizophrenia, do they not have some kind of almost, it affects part of your brain that affects your muscles, doesn't it?
What do you mean?
Schizophrenia does that. It affects your dopamine levels, doesn't it?
The dopamine theory of schizophrenia is that there's excess of dopamine, but that doesn't necessarily affect your muscles. Maybe you're thinking of the side effects of the medication that can cause muscular stiffness.
I guess there's kind of both at work. But I mean, there's sometimes there are people there, they'll just be talking to themselves and they have schizophrenia.
Right.
And we didn't see any of that on the defendant. When he's in that interview room with Briley, he's not talking to himself.
No, he does not appear to be talking to himself.
And you didn't see that backseat video, but if you heard that he wasn't talking to himself or talking other than when somebody was listening to him, I mean, you wouldn't argue with that if I told you that's what we saw.
I would not argue with that, no.
And so so he's not sitting there on the interview with Briley just muttering to himself while nobody's looking.
Correct.
I mean, he has an audience when he's talking.
Right.
Officer Briley.
Yes.
And then while we're on the subject of Officer Briley, he made some comments to him about, I guess, whether he knew what he did was wrong.
Yes, he did.
In fact, Officer Briley asked him, after you kill those two men, what did you do next? And he said, I fled, right?
Yes,
I mean, he actually used the word fled and not just left like he did with you.
yes,
And when Officer Briley said, you know what you did today was wrong, you understand that? And he said, yes, sir.
he said that.
And then he told Ranger Briley, Ranger Briley says, the reason you fled, right, because you knew it was wrong. And he said, I knew there was certain shit that was wrong about it.
Yes,
And then Briley said, some of that certain shit was killing them and you knew that was wrong, right? And he said, right.
yes,
And then he asked Ranger Briley, he said, I'd like to hug my mom one last time, you know? I mean, what does one last time implies? He knows he's not going to see her for a while.
correct.
Knows he's going to jail.
Yes,
And Ranger Briley said, you want to do that because you know what you did was wrong today. You shot Chad and Chris, right? And he said, yep. Right?
yes,
And then Briley said, you feel bad about that. And then he didn't really answer audibly. Briley asked him, you've stated to me that you'd like to say that you're sorry for what you've done. And he said, right.
correct.
And Briley said, like to the families, would you like to say to them, right? What would you like to say to them if you had the opportunity to talk to them? And the defendant says, I'd tell them I was so sorry for what I had done. And if I could have done it differently. I would have done it so much differently. I just wish these handcuffs weren't on me. He said that, right?
Yes,
And then Briley asked him, you know the difference between right and wrong? And he said, yes, sir.
yes,
He told Ranger Briley, Ranger Briley says to him, you tried to run from the police. Isn't that right? I heard them talking and you were trying to get you to give up. And what I heard you saying was, you know, just come on, get out, you know, surrender. And he said, yep, that's what they're saying. And Ranger Briley says, why weren't you complying? Because of what happened? And he says, yeah.
I can represent the court. I will rest in a minute and then if we have some other issues with experts, I'll have to put a signal down here.
All right, if there is, you can call expert in rebuttal.
Your Honor, we do anticipate calling two experts.
hours.
And was that interview conducted at the Erath County Jail?
Yes, sir.
Was your first kind of evaluation that he had a personality disorder?
Well, that's one of my conclusions, yes.
Well, I guess I'm not going to go into it at length today. We'll do that tomorrow. Did the second evaluation determine he had a psychosis to a certain degree?
Yes, that I thought the first one did as well, but a cannabis-induced psychosis is the technical name in the DSM-5.
Was that on the second report?
Well, I know it was on the second report, and I thought that was one of the conclusions on the preliminary as well, but I can check right quick.
Okay.
Well, on the first report, it said substance-induced psychotic disorder secondary to cannabis by history. And then it said cannabis use disorder with perceptual disturbances. And then in the second one, I confirmed all that and said that, in my opinion, at the time of the offense, he had substance-induced psychotic disorder secondary to cannabis is one of the diagnoses at the time surrounding the offense.
Judge, that's all I have for Dr. Price today.
Sure. Need to follow up with anything? All right, you may step down.
Right.
You may.
For the record, state your name.
My name is Dr. Michael Arambula,
Arambula,
right?
did you start out as a pharmacist?
Yes, I worked several years as a pharmacist, including while I was in med school.
So tell me about your practice briefly. What is your practice entail?
I'm in private practice, and then I'm also a public servant to the state of Texas. Within my private practice, there are basically 3 areas. I see patients about probably a third of my time, strictly outpatient at this stage of my career. I spend probably about half of my time in forensics, providing consults to the state of Texas. I work for the U.S. government. I work outside of Texas and other, as well as law firms, mostly civil, but I do some criminal as well. And then the rest of my practice is, as I stated, in public service. I'm currently the president of the Texas Medical Board and spend a significant amount of time, excuse me, in Austin.
More specifically, were you asked to conduct an examination on my client Eddie Ralph?
Yes,
Were you asked to make an insanity evaluation on Mr. Ralph?
yes,
And did you do that?
I did.
I don't want to know what your conclusion is to that. I want to know, did you make, lack of a better word, some diagnosis regarding anything Mr. Ralph could have suffered from?
Yes, I did.
What is that?
The ones in my report that I listed included alcohol abuse, cannabis abuse, anxiety disorder, a mood disorder.
That's it?
Yes.
Didn't find any psychosis at all?
Well, the mood disorder, based on the records that I reviewed, and what I observed in the videos, you could say that it's still encompassed under a mood disorder.
And if I ask you this, I apologize, I don't remember. How long was the interview with Mr. Ralph on January 30th?
3.5 hours
And where was that done?
in the Erath County Detention Center,
Up by the control?
right to the right of the central control.
Was he cooperative with you?
Yes,
Was he pleasant with you?
yes.
Did he answer your questions?
For the most part, there were some times where he was a bit evasive, but that happens with everybody.
And you reached a conclusion regarding your evaluation on his sanity, is that right?
I did.
That's all I have for today, Your Honor.
I just wanted to make before you get up, leave real quick, Dr. Rambula. I just wanted to make sure it was clear. How long did you practice as a pharmacist after you got your bachelor's degree in pharmacy?
8 years.
And then you got your PhD in pharmacy, correct?
It's actually a doctor of pharmacy,
Doctor of pharmacy.
a PharmD.
And then did you practice as a pharmacist after you got your doctorate in pharmacy?
No.
Okay. So you got that and then went, I'm going to medical school.
Well, actually, people have asked me about that. I actually received my PharmD after I was a physician.
Okay.
And it just turned out that I could do it. Being a pharmacist has always separated me from the other docs. No offense. I like pharm is my first love, so I did it in my spare time. It took me longer than usual, but I did it.
And you're board certified in psychiatry.
In general and forensics psychiatry, yes.
And then do you also teach forensic psychiatry in medical schools?
Yes, I since I finished my fellowship, I pretty much ran the didactic program at the med school in San Antonio. At one point, we had a fellowship program, and so I took care of the civil areas and the evaluation and treatment of sex offenders here in our state, and those are my areas that are covered. Since I've been on the medical board, most of my lectures have been to students and residents just in general regarding professionalism and the kinds of behavior that we expect from them here in the state of Texas.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Nothing further until tomorrow.
All right, you may step down.